Hello YouTube. Have you heard of the High Elves? The Nords perhaps? Maybe even the Orcs? Now, the Elder Scrolls universe is full of interesting races, and there's a lot more than just the playable ones, and over the years I've talked about many of them on this channel, from the hilarious intelligent Imga ape man, to the mythical intelligent bird man, to the mysterious and elusive shapeshifter race. In this long lore collection I put all the lore on those races together for you to enjoy with timestamps in case you want to skip a certain race or if you want to skip this intro, for example. So, without any further ado, let us get into the first race in this video, Black Marsh's intelligent foxman, the now extinct Lilmothiit. So, the Lilmothiit, a fox-like beast race that lived somewhere in the southern parts of Black Marsh during the Meretic era, the First Era, and the first few years of the Second Era before completely going extinct. The area that they lived in likely looked something like this, with them primarily living near the coasts and in the lighter parts of the swamps for most of their history. They seem to have lived in a tribal society comprised of small towns and villages, with large parts of their population also still being active nomads, trekking from place to place in the swamps with their small tents and living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. In the years since my original video, we have gotten some unused official Bethesda concept art of the Lilmothiit, and their nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle is clearly reflected in their clothing in this concept art. They carry large packs with them, they have walking canes for trekking longer distances, and their clothes are mostly being made out of animal furs and hides, which is something that we also learn from other sources, but indicates a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. We also know that they were toy makers, as they made kites for their children to play with, and from one second-hand source that we have, we know that the Lilmothiit, while mostly tribal and nomadic, had quite a well-versed knowledge of plants and their medicinal purposes, being able to make what is likely the most advanced medicine you would find in Black Marsh's swamplands at that time, as they seem to have known more about medicine than the Argonians and the Kothringi human tribes. They were also not very warlike. There are some famous accounts of their tribes being quite skittish and rather than fight, flee and hide when strangers enter their territory, or if they're being threatened by other peoples. They seem to have more often moved their camp or even moved out of towns and cities rather than fighting with people that threaten them, with them historically apparently being quite easy targets for slavers as well, likely because they didn't fight back all that much. This may indicate that they were either a very weak people, which I think is a bit unlikely considering that they were able to survive hunting in the treacherous swamps and their concept art does depict them as warriors, or it could indicate that perhaps their culture or religion somehow heavily advocated peace, with perhaps fighting being heretical or something like that. I think that's a bit more likely than them being weak, but hey, we don't really know. Something else that we know is that the name Lilmothiit is actually not the name that this people gave to themselves. Rather, Lilmothiit is a word in the Khajiiti language which means one who is from Lilmoth, with Lilmoth being a city in Black Marsh that was originally founded by this fox race. However, on Tamriel, the name Lilmothiit is now so widely used by scholars that study the race that people have simply gotten used to using this name for the fox-like beast race, but we unfortunately have no idea what they used to call themselves when they were still alive. What is pretty funny though is that even on Tamriel having knowledge on the Lilmothiit is quite rare. While scholars on Tamriel know quite a bit, we have multiple sources of people on Tamriel who aren't scholars that don't even believe that they existed at some point, because not many non-Argonians have trekked ever that deep into the swamps to have seen the areas that they lived in, and even the areas they lived in, well, there aren't many traces of them left since they mostly used tents and very non-permanent wooden huts which rot away pretty quickly, which means that there aren't many traces of their civilization left. And by now, or really any point after the early Second or late First Era, those people who don't believe that they existed, they'll never even get to see a live one ever again, as by the early Second Era the Lilmothiit were driven to complete extinction. The final nail of the coffin for them is often considered to have been the Khanatan flu, one of Tamriel's worst epidemics. A video on the full story of that epidemic is in the description of this video. But what you need to know for this video is that the remaining Lilmothiit population by this point was wiped out completely due to the disease's quick spread and drastic effects. However, even by this point, the Lilmothiit were already considered to be a bit of a rare sighting. While at one point they had lived in quite sizable towns, seemingly starting a sedentary lifestyle a bit away from nomadic life. By the latter parts of the First Era, their towns were mostly abandoned. Some say that they got pushed out by the Argonians who wanted to live in those towns. Others say that it was more of a gradual process of Argonians moving in, them living peacefully together for a while, but then the Lilmothiit moving out of their own accord back into the swamps. But whatever the reason is, by this time most of the Lilmothiit had moved back to the swamps for some unknown reason to a nomadic lifestyle, or to live in very small villages in the deep swamps rather than in a bit bigger towns and cities near the coasts. And then the Knaten flu hit this already declining community extremely hard, to the point where none of the Lilmothiit are alive today on Tamriel. Now, a final bit of speculation is that a lot of in-universe scholars and people online in our universe have speculated that the Lilmothiit may be related to the Khajiit in some way. If that's true, then it's quite likely that they too may have had some sort of birth cycle when they were active on Tamriel. As I covered in my video on the different types of Khajiit, the Khajiit come in many shapes and sizes, with the type of Khajiit that you are born as being determined by the stances of the moons. If it's true that the Lilmothiit people were indeed related to the Khajiit, then I think that the moons may have played a significant role in their religion as well, and then there must have been different types of Lilmothiit across the swamp, maybe small ones like the Khajiit Alfik, and really big ones like the Pamar and the Senshi. But unfortunately there is no concrete proof for any of this. I mean, all that we have on their looks is this official concept art that you see in the background of this video all the time. And really, that's just about all I can say about the Lilmothiit. Now, next we will talk about another extinct race of Tamriel, or rather almost extinct, the Snow Elves, or the ancient Falmer of Tamriel, before their corruption into the goblin-like creatures that we now know as the Falmer. So, the Snow Elves, the milk-white skinned race of elf that lived in the area now known as Skyrim ever since some of the ARTTAiR, the progenitor race to all races of elf on Tamriel, migrated from the Somerset Isles to the northern reaches of Tamriel. They seem to have been very similar to High Elves, except with white hair and very light white skins, and they seem to be more resistant to cold than most races of elf. In the northern reaches of Tamriel they built a civilization that was said to be one of the great powers of ancient Tamriel. Their civilization was said to be advanced enough to rival the elves left behind on the Somerset Isles and the Ayleid Empire in the heartland of Tamriel. Very little is known about their civilization during this high period of the Snow Elves, when they were at the peak of their power, as the Nords, who would wipe them out several centuries later, made sure to destroy as much of their history as they could. But from what we know that they were quite a religious people, worshipping a similar pantheon of gods to the modern day High Elves, with their chief deity being Auriel, with Trinimac, Ciribane, Jeffrey and Finister also being represented in their pantheons, with many of the ancient Snow Elves wishing to be more close to the gods and to be one with the gods. Now, we also know that they had an advanced writing system and their own calendar, which differed highly from the Tamrielic calendars that we know. You see, while the Tamrielic calendar that we know basically mimics the Gregorian calendar from our world, just with different names, the Falmer calendar had a strange system that we haven't quite figured out yet, but it makes use of so-called markings and kulnirs, which are both seemingly measures of time, with markings likely either being a week or a day, and kulnirs likely being something akin to either a month or a year, as markings seem to change quicker than kulnirs in Snow Elf journals, meaning that kulnirs likely talk about a longer period of time. But we don't really know how the system works precisely. Actually, we have no actual idea. Some on Tamriel suggested that the markings and kulnirs may not even be units of time specifically, but rather maybe the filling of time ewers, which then gets recorded by journals. But even then, that's just speculation of in-universe scholars. Still, it's quite interesting though that their entire system was completely different from the other systems on Tamriel. Now, their language was said to be complicated, but in a sense quite similar to that of the Ayleids, with there being enough similarities in order for you to roughly understand Falmer texts if you know the Ayleid language, although many words seem to differ in the language. Their writing system was also very similar to that of other elves, although their letters are far more complicated and stylized than most other races of elves writing, with it being more similar to the Ayleidun language or the ancient ARTTAiR language, than something like the Dwemer, which was highly simplified. Now, other than that, we know that they likely had kings and queens, and we know that they were able to build some of the most advanced architecture and statues of that period in Tamriel's history, and we also know that the color white played a pretty big role in their iconography and architecture, as they made almost everything of snow white color and stone. Now finally, we also know that magic played quite a big role in their society, with magic being central to some of the methods of transportation, and the Snow Elf race as a whole having a relatively high aptitude for magic. And that is basically all we know about their culture, as everything else from their foods to their governmental system was all erased from history by the Nords after centuries of conflict. You see, while the Snow Elves had lived in Skyrim for hundreds of years, at some point ships started landing on Skyrim's northern shores. Ships full of humans who came from ARTTAiR, the ancestral homeland of the humans. Now, at first these were mostly criminals who were exiled from ARTTair and second sons of nobles looking for adventure and glory in far-off lands with their retinue. The humans weren't really not all that much more than a curiosity in those days, and most humans traveled further south to warmer lands, eventually becoming the Proto-Imperials and the humans of Hammerfell. But some stuck around, living in Skyrim with the Snow Elves in what has been called an uneasy harmony, where both races just kinda tolerated each other and didn't really bother each other too much. But the humans kept coming and coming from ARTTair, as more and more humans decided to colonize Tamriel. And eventually small human villages became small cities, and small cities became larger cities, and the human proto-Nords gradually expanded their influence over the continent and throughout the province of Skyrim. Now, we don't know much about this period. In fact, all we know is that eventually it led to tragedy, as the first official ARTTair colony on Tamriel, and also the largest city of the proto-Nords, the city of Saarthal, eventually became the site of a massive raid by the Snow Elves, who are said to have killed off the entire population of Proto-Nords living in the city and had burned the entire city to the ground. Why exactly they did this, we don't know. It's been suggested that the Eye of Magnus that we find during the College of Winterhold questline was the cause, as the humans found it in the ground and the Snow Elves then wanted it, as it has extreme power, leading the Snow Elves to destroying the city to get their hands on the Eye of Magnus. But it's also been suggested that the geopolitical tensions had been mounting between the two races either way, with the Snow Elves being uneasy and angry about the massive human expansion. What the true reason is, we don't know. You see, almost everything we know about this period, I dare say everything about this period, unless I missed a source, is either interpreted by people who lived thousands of years after the event, or is taken from Nordic mythology and histories, which both aren't super reliable, especially Nordic histories, as we know that the Nords did everything that they could to demonize the Snow Elves. So yeah, it's possible that something else may have caused the tragedy of Saarthal, but if so, it's either been erased from history or we will just never find out. Anyway, this massacre of Saarthal led to one of the few survivors, Lord Ysgramor, later the legendary King Ysgramor, to travel back to ARTTair and petition their ancient homeland for help. He then came with the 500 companions, which likely was a massive army instead of just 500 men, just like the 300 Spartans were actually not 300 Spartans in our universe, but a pretty big fighting force, which had 300 Spartans but a lot more men next to them as well. Anyway, doesn't really matter about the numbers, but Ysgramor and his men returned to Tamriel and they were ready for round 2. And from the moment that they landed on Tamriel, the war was on and they started conquering Skyrim from the Snow Elves, killing many in the process and committing pretty horrible atrocities against the Snow Elves in the process, ending the Snow Elf dominance in Skyrim. Mostly as a revenge for what happened in Saarthal, according to the histories. Now, something interesting here is that while many lore videos like this one and articles online seem to claim that from this point on it was full-on killing and the Nords did not stop killing Snow Elves until there were none left, it was a far more gradual process than that. You see, while Ysgramor's initial conquering seemed to have signaled the end of Snow Elf dominance in Skyrim, it was by no means the end of their culture, although it was the start of an ages-long conflict between the two races, where the Snow Elves gradually became less and less powerful, because the Snow Elves were still around by the time of the Dragon War and were able to build cities and temples until the early First Era. However, this seems to have been a time where the Nords had very little regard for their culture, and if they required their land, they simply took it from the Snow Elves. And wherever the Snow Elves lived under Nordic rule, they seem to have been virtually second-class citizens. It was only when Harold, the first High King of all of Skyrim, actually started to try and get rid of all Snow Elf holdings and culture in Skyrim, centuries after the initial conquest of Ysgramor, that Snow Elf culture was truly pushed to the brink and eventually pushed to extinction. These lost years between Ysgramor's conquest and Harold's conquest have been pretty terribly documented, but they are a period of at least 300 to 500 years in which the Snow Elves endured, but in a Nord-dominated Skyrim. We don't know what caused the final schism and confrontation which led King Harold and his heirs to try and actually get rid of all Snow Elves and completely erase them from history by burning their records and destroying their buildings, but we do know that they were pretty successful, as very little remains of Snow Elf culture after the First Era, with only ruins deep underground remaining in some places and hidden enclaves that the Nords never found still remaining, like the Forgotten Vale that we visit in Skyrim's Dawnguard DLC. But even with the fury of the Nords at their heels, the Snow Elves did not go down without a fight. These were wars with many casualties on both sides, but the Nords would prevail, as eventually they pushed the Snow Elves to the brink of extinction after killing as many as they could and destroying as many settlements as they could find. During this time, many Snow Elves went into hiding. Now, interestingly enough, it seems that not all the Nords hated the Snow Elves all that much, as some helped Snow Elf families hide themselves from the king's armies in occupied territories. But it did not help to stave off their eventual near extinction, as during the first couple of centuries of the First Era, the final battle of the Nords against the Snow Elves would take place. It was the Snow Elves' final stand on the island of Solstheim, which had been long a safe haven away from the Nords, but after driving out or killing the Elves on the mainland, the Nords came for Solstheim, where the last leader of the Snow Elves, someone that we only remember as the Snow Prince, would make his last stand against the Nords, who came with overwhelming fury. But it did not matter in the end. Despite his valiant stand and many Nords killed, the Snow Prince and his men could not stand against the onslaught. Now, legend says that the Snow Prince, after killing many great Nord warriors, was killed by a young girl, Finna, who had thrown her mother's sword at the prince after the prince had killed her mother on the battlefield. This blow killed the Snow Prince, and now leaderless, the Snow Elves had fought their final fight. Those who remained had few choices left. Some seemed to have fled Skyrim and intermingled with the High Elves, the Ayleids and the Durenni Elves, with some elves nowadays in Tamriel still believing that they have Snow Elf blood in them due to these refugees who fled, and others hid themselves away in hidden places like the Chantry of Auriel and the Forgotten Vale, hoping to escape further onslaught. But the vast majority of survivors of the final battles against the Nords would find even further tragedy, as they turned to the underground dwelling Dwemer for help. Now, most people by now know the story. The beaten down Snow Elves came to the Dwemer for aid and refuge, and their ancient allies decided to provide that help, but at a terrible price, as any who would want to find refuge in Dwemer cities was forced to eat a strange fungus which would blind them. That was the Dwemer's demand. Many agreed, leading to the blinding of the majority of the surviving Snow Elves, and from that point on it was even more downhill for them, as the Dwemer soon revealed their true colors and started to treat those who sought refuge in their cities as slaves, forcing them into slave labor and mistreating them horribly, brutally torturing anyone who did not submit to them. It's been suggested that during this time the Dwemer also used tonal magic or sound magic on the Snow Elves to influence their minds and keep them in line. Some of these machines we can still see working in the Elder Scrolls Online, where it shows that when they malfunction, nearby creatures get driven completely mad, and while we don't know for certain, this might have also been part of the reason as to why after several generations of enslavement, the Snow Elves eventually became far more warped and corrupted, as the Dwemer simply bred them for slavery and influenced their minds. Now, slowly over the years they were warped and corrupted into the hideous blind Falmer that we see in the games. Interestingly, Falmer was the original name of their race, translating roughly to Snow Elf, but those Snow Elves who survived the onslaught and denied the Dwemer's bargain would stop using that name, calling themselves simply the Snow Elves, as the name Falmer would soon be linked to the hideous creatures which were betrayed and enslaved by the Dwemer. It's a terrible fate that so many endured, although there was one point in time when the Falmer, already far in their corruption and almost unrecognizable to what their ancestors had once looked like, started to rebel against the Dwemer. We don't know much about this rebellion, but we do know that this rebellion quickly spread throughout all the Dwemer cities in Skyrim, where the corrupted Snow Elves rebelled against their Dwemer masters in what's now known as the War of the Crag, a conflict that the Falmer slowly started to win around the year 700 of the First Era. But then the Dwemer disappeared. They simply vanished. And when their masters were gone and the war was over, the now corrupted and blinded Snow Elves were free. But were they really free, as their race had descended into a corruption so bad that nothing of their previous culture seemed to remain, as they had now been warped into creatures closer to goblins than to elves, and even their very souls had been warped, as no longer did their souls need black soul gems to be captured, which are used for intelligent races, but now a simple white soul gem was enough, indicating that something fundamental had truly changed in their being, again possibly due to Dwemer tonal magic. In the subsequent years, the Falmer would take over the Dwemer cities for themselves, and some would rediscover that there was a whole world above them, the surface world. Although very few Falmer would tread there in the beginning, slowly but surely more and more sometimes left their caves and ruins by night, starting to raid Nordic villages and steal cattle and murder sleeping Nords. By later eras, most people see the Falmer as more than legend, a scary boogeyman of children's stories. But those living close to Dwemer ruins and cave systems know better, as sometimes on dark nights the Falmer come out and steal their cattle and murder their children. By the 4th era, it's said by Paladin Galabor, one of the very few remaining actual Snow Elves who we meet during the Dawnguard questline, that over the centuries he's seeing a rising in intelligence, and so do some scholars who have tried to study the Falmer, as they say that the Falmer are becoming more organized than they ever were, with raiding parties being more organized and a hierarchy actually existing in their society. Not just that, they actually keep and breed creatures for livestock, they seem to have shrines to some god, and they seem to be able to build relatively advanced structures. This may point towards further evolution, or perhaps generations and millennia are slowly starting to wear off the corruption caused by the Dwemer. Now, does that mean that there's hope for them? Perhaps. I don't think it's likely that they will ever return to their former glory or appearance, though as Paladin Galabor says, perhaps if they become even more intelligent, the people of Tamriel could once again communicate with them, and with communication actually give them a proper place in this world. But if that's ever to happen, it's likely centuries away. But to be honest, it was quite a tragic story. While the Nords would say that they deserved their doom, I'd say that the fate of their race was just a tad bit harsh. Anyway, now let us talk about one of Tamriel's more mysterious races, a race that we've barely seen in any of the games and whose existence was doubted for a long time. Tamriel's Shapeshifters. So, Changelings or Shapeshifters. They are formless creatures which can transform into almost any type of living creature, including the playable races of Tamriel. While Changelings aren't truly immortal, they are ageless, with some of them, if not all of them, being born alongside the mortal plane before the very first mortal creatures walked the land, and on modern day Tamriel they are extremely rare. While historians and scholars from institutions such as the Mages Guild are aware of the existence of Changelings, they are only encountered once every few hundred years or so, and even then their contact with the outside world is often fleeting. Now, a quick side note to this is that after doing my research I saw on the UESP that apparently a scrapped concept during the Elder Scrolls Online's development was that Changelings were simply living normal lives alongside Tamriel's population, who were all unaware that they are Changelings. While it's a cut concept and I couldn't find the primary source it came from, it does mean that it's possible that there are many more Changelings around Tamriel than we know, and they just hide it very, very well. And there's a good reason for them to hide it, and for them to only open themselves either to those that they trust, or to only live openly as a changeling in very remote places. Because in some places they are, or at least they were, hunted. You see, the only known tale which tells us of the origin of changelings is the Bosmer or Wood Elf creation myth. While it's not an absolute guarantee that this story is the true origin of changelings, as every creation myth suffers heavily from unreliable narrator problems, it is the only story that we have on changeling origins. Alright, so according to the Bosmer, the world started out as one big formless chaos that has no names, no shapes, no purpose. It was simply chaos, without a beginning or an end. This chaos the Bosmer called the Ooze. Now this Ooze was filled with formless spirits who were in a way all changelings and shapeshifters, as they could be everything and nothing at the same time. Then at some point came Ifre, god of the forest, who sang to the formless Ooze, and with this singing began to form things out of chaos. Ifre's songs held stories, and these stories produced everything from animals to trees to rocks to water, all from the formless chaos. Now, the formless spirits of the Ooze all enjoyed this new reality, and they constantly shapeshifted across this new world which they called the Green. Ifra, however, was to sing a final song, and with that final song he sang the shapeshifting spirits into a shape, giving them form, mortality, and also giving them a purpose. Because these shapeshifting spirits, now no longer shapeshifting, became the Bosmer or the Wood Elves, and their purpose would be the Green Pact, the holy pact with the god Ifre, which forbids the Bosmer from harming the trees of Valenwood, or any part of the forest actually, and it also forbids shapeshifting. The Wood Elves then lost their shapeshifting abilities, except for during a wild hunt, which is an event of sorts which groups of Bosmer can use in times of true desperation, in which through a ritual they can shapeshift into fearsome creatures of the forest. Now, even though this power is said to be gifted to them by Ifre, the Bosmer do rarely use it, only using it in times of true desperation, because the transformations are said to be irreversible, and as such it's a bit of a taboo subject to openly speak of in Bosmer society. That said, these people who change during the Wild Hunt are not the changelings that we talk about in this video, because you see some of the formless spirits actually rejected Ifre's final song, rejecting the Green Pact and rejecting a mortal shape form. These formless spirits are said to have been the first Green Pact Oathbreakers, and a civil war broke out as the Bosmer teamed up with Ifre to subdue these rebelling formless spirits. Ifre eventually struck down these spirits with the help of the Bosmer, banishing them to what remained of the Ooze, where they would forever be locked into primordial shapeless chaos, never to escape it to the mortal world, only being able to communicate with the outside world through Bosmer religious rituals, being able to watch the mortal world, but to never return and participate in it. Now, over the millennia, the souls of many Bosmer Green Pact breakers, those who harm the forest or do not adhere to the other Green Pact rules, joined these first Oathbreakers, or Shapeshifters or Changelings, in the Ooze, awaiting the final end in the formless chaos of the Ooze. But not all shape-shifting formless spirits were caught by Ifre and the Bosmer. Some did not fight, but rather fled during this civil war kind of thing, where Ifre tried to crusade against all the shapeshifters. And those who did not fight but rather fled, they faded into obscurity over the ages. Some fled to the deepest, most chaotic parts of the forest, where even the Bosmer did not dare tread, and others presumably attempted to simply blend in somewhere else if we are to believe content. Now, these changelings, they do possess great power, as they are primordial spirits who were presumably there during and after creation. They can take any shape they wish, although some sources suggest that shape-shifting is something that they cannot just do at will and it simply happens to them. So they cannot determine their own shape, or when they shift even, unless they are taught by a god like Ifre, since they are, basically, a spirit of chaos. So something like that is not something that they can control. Now, this is something that we know from the character Selene, who is by far the most well-known changeling, who appeared in both the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena and in the Elder Scrolls Online. Fun fact, next to being a creature which was likely there during the period of creation, she is also one of the first characters in the Elder Scrolls series period, being there at the creation of the series, since she features quite extensively in one of the quests of the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, as Selene is definitely a creature who deserves her own video someday, where her story can be told in full. Now, to get back to the point, Selene was one of the spirits who retreated deep into the forest during Ifre's war on changelings and hid herself in a place called Selene's Web. A place so deep in the forest that not even the Bosmer themselves dare to tread there, and those who do are said to never return. Now, the first credited outsider to ever enter these forests of Selene's Web was Vanus Galarian, the founder of the Mages Guild, who in exchange for being allowed to open a guild hall in Eldenroot, was sent to investigate this part of the forest for the Sylvanar, who simply said is one of the leaders of the Bosmer people, as not even he knew what was in this part of the forest. Now, when Vanus Galarian entered the deep forest of Selene's Web, he encountered Selene, then in the form of a massive spider who quickly bound his arms and legs in a spider web. Vanus Galarian was actually quite shocked when she then transformed into a female High Elf, and not just a High Elf, but rather a female version of Vanus Galarian, as Selene had never seen a High Elf before and thus simply changed into a female version of him, since apparently you have to have seen what you want to transform into, if you have control of your transformations, which is quite interesting. Now, she likely did this to put him at ease, not realizing that shapeshifting into a female version of someone themselves unnerves them even more, but unnerved or not, Vanus recognized her to be a changeling as he knew about their existence, and he spoke to her, the first shapeshifter to be encountered by mages in nearly 1,000 years according to him. After convincing her that he meant her no harm, she unbound him, and apparently they spoke for a very long time. From this conversation, Vanus derived that she was an ageless being for which time did not hold much meaning, and that she was taught to control her shapeshifting abilities by a powerful creature that she worships as the god of spiders called Shagrath, who Vanus Galarian speculates to have been some aspect of the Daedric prince Mephala most likely, or another strong primordial spirit that's either now gone or also lives in these remote kind of regions and just has never been encountered by mortals. Now, After their civilized conversation, Vannes proposed to her that he would negotiate on her behalf with the Bosmer, as it turned out that she was the one who was responsible for the Bosmer that never returned from that part of the forest, as she likely saw Bosmer, you know, the people who allied with Ifra against her, entering with weapons, likely to hunt animals for food, but she doesn't know that, as a threat, even if the weapons were used to hunt animals. Her last contact with the Bosmer had been when she was hunted, so she usually just killed or enthralled them out of self-preservation. Now, Vannes, when he returned to the Sylvanar, he revealed the existence of Selene to him, and her wish to be left alone. While at first the Sylvanar was hesitant, considering the changing shape thing goes against the Green Pact, Vannes convinced him and the Green Lady, another leader of the Bosmer, to respect the boundaries of her domain, as it had been so long since Ifra's crusade against the Changelings and so little of them are left, that it would be a shame and also a bit childish to take her down now. Considering that she was likely one of the only remaining creatures to have walked alongside Ifra in better times during creation before their whole schism, and considering the fact that it's been that long, the Sylvanar and the Green Lady relented, and they decided to respect the boundaries of her domain. At the same time, Vannes vowed on the behalf of the Mages Guild that the Mages Guild would also respect the boundaries of her domain, therefore leaving Selene to her domain, never to be disturbed. Or, so was the plan, because as you'll see in my future video on Selene, power-hungry individuals who learned of her existence would still try to invade her domain in order to try and take some of her primordial power for themselves, giving even more examples of why those few remaining changelings would not wish to be disturbed and likely keep themselves hidden in the deepest parts of the forest. That being said, the changelings, in essence being primordial spirits, not only have the power of shapeshifting, they also have an almost unrivaled knowledge of the mortal plane's workings, and therefore are able to use magical powers which are even beyond the scope of the most accomplished mages, leading to the few changelings that we know of to be very powerful mages using strange and powerful magics when in human or elvish or Argonian or Khajiit form. And that's basically all we know about the shapeshifters. Now, next let's talk about a Tamrielic race that some would rather call a creature, but we know that they are just as, if not more, intelligent as some of the playable races. Their culture is just far more primitive, it seems. I'm talking about the Nereids, or Tamriel's mermaids as some would call them. So, Nereids, also called water sprites or water nymphs, are mystical creatures that live near bodies of water that they are linked to and will protect. They look a bit like female elves, but with blue, turquoise, scaly skin, full lips, blue eyes and fin-like ears. Some sources describe them as too beautiful for mortal eyes, and as we'll talk about later, some mortals tend to fall in love with Nereids, mirroring mermaid legends in our own universe. Now, Nereids function a bit like Spriggans, because just like how Spriggans tend to protect and take care of wooded groves and their wildlife, Nereids will do the same to ponds, springs and lagoons. They seem to prefer non-contaminated and flowing water, and generally they will not be aggressive to mortals unless they see them as a threat to the health of the ecosystem that they protect. Some Nereids, however, seem to be always aggressive to mortals, which I suppose could come from the fact that they see mortals in general as a threat to their ecosystems, considering what mortals generally tend to do to ecosystems, you know. Chop down trees, contaminate the water, that kind of thing. Because of this, some communities have negative legends about the Nereids, saying that they are simply vengeful spirits born from the bodies of women who were murdered and whose body was thrown into the water. While other communities have far more positive legends about the Nereids. Because the Nereids are apparently quite intelligent creatures and are able to learn mortal languages with some effort. We know that they are quite advanced in magic, having mastery over the strange and mysterious form of magic called water magic, which gives them control over the water and its properties. They can use simple water to heal creatures, which has led to communities forming around the ponds of good-natured Nereids, where people come to the Nereid to be healed from their ailments, and in some cases mortals can even start to venerate the Nereids for their power. But unlike other quite intelligent creatures, they don't really seem to build anything themselves or craft anything. They are known to adorn themselves in shells and surround themselves in water as some form of clothes with their water magic, but they don't seem to produce anything themselves. They do, however, use things that are left behind by mortals. For example, we know that Nereids are quite fond of mortal jewelry, silver in particular. And they are known to inhabit the ruins of the houses of Tamriel's mortals if those ruins are close to their bodies of water. That being said, it seems like the Nereids are both fine to live by themselves and in groups. When they live in groups, they often live under a matriarch who leads the group, which is often called an Empress Nereid, but they also seem perfectly fine to live by themselves, especially when the body of water they are linked to is quite small. But this also has a negative side, as the smaller their pond is, the more vulnerable the Nereid is. As I touched upon earlier in the video, Nereids are linked to their body of water, and when I say linked, I mean that quite literally. Because if the water becomes poisoned or contaminated, the Nereid can die or become mentally corrupted. A good example is that during the Knaten flu, one of Tamriel's worst diseases, a video on that is in the description if you want to see it, people sought out Nereids for a cure. However, there's an example of a Nereid curing so many people that the water of her pond became completely contaminated, as sick people entered her water and slowly degraded its quality with their presence. This made the good-natured Nereid who wanted to cure them lose her mind and eventually become corrupted, leading her to become a vengeful creature looking to inflict and kill mortals as she became contaminated with the plague herself. The only way to then purify the pond would have been to kill the Nereid, as the corrupted Nereid no longer sought to nurture the water but rather sought it to keep it in its contaminated state. Pretty grim stuff, to be honest. Now, when used responsibly, their control over water is astonishing. While some Nereids will wear mortal clothes, according to the lore most tend to prefer staying naked and shroud themselves in water instead, making sort of water clothed. Although we don't see this in the games, where for obvious reasons they have shell bras and tattered robes. That being said, they are perceived by the people of Tamriel to be quite attractive, and they often sing an angelic transfixing song which can intoxicate mortals and is apparently especially intoxicating to men. One common trope can be how a man is seduced and then enthralled by the Nereid's call, not dissimilar to mermaid legends in our own world. The funny thing is though that in the poem where we learn this, it actually said that the Nereids don't really care for mortal men. And rather the men are just entranced by their song, but they don't want anything to do with the men. Now, we don't know the origins of the Nereids, whether they are mortal, immortal, who created them, we have no idea. We don't even know how they procreate. Obviously some have speculated that they procreate with mortals, but that doesn't seem to be true. But considering some races view them as spirits and they are not dissimilar to Spriggans in their behavior, I think just like the Spriggans their true origin will remain a bit of a mystery to us, although it's possible that they are a type of fairy. But it's quite clear that they are basically a replacement for Daggerfall's nymph creature, as they share some characteristics, and the concept of a nymph, basically a magical naked woman, has become a bit outdated and boring compared to the other creatures that we now have in the Elder Scrolls universe. So I personally welcome that change, but you know, there aren't really a one-for-one replacement, as the nymph has some unique and interesting lore itself. So then, having said everything I can about the Nereids, why not now talk about the nymphs? So the nymphs, elusive creatures if anything, whom we haven't seen since Daggerfall, and with good reason. I mean, look at these sprites. Well, yeah, they're basically just naked women. But that isn't to say that despite their not so child-friendly appearance that they aren't interesting. Anyway, nymphs in the Elder Scrolls universe are viewed in the same fashion that most of us view them. Magical creatures who look like naked women, and the stigma among in-universe academics, so on Tamriel, is that they're rare but very promiscuous and fulfill sexual desires for anyone who approaches them. Therefore, the in-universe academic scene on these creatures is not very broad, as most in-universe scholars view the nymph as a creature not really worth for research, and all documentation the people on Tamriel themselves really have on them is that of basically borderline pornographic descriptions and crude half-fiction by those who claim to have met a nymph. That said, most of that is proven to be untrue by a man named Vondhem Barris, a scholar of the Imperial University, who at some point decided to do some research into what nymphs are really like and whether the stereotype that the people of Tamriel have on these creatures is accurate or not. Needless to say, he was ridiculed by most of Tamriel's academic community and not many took him seriously. Luckily for us, he wasn't dissuaded by his peers and decided to start researching the nymphs anyway. And his findings are definitely notable. First of all, he started with the language. Nymphs have their own language, something which is a perk to acquire in the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall. Learning the language of the nymphs means that they won't attack you. This language is said to be very complicated and very hard for the people of Tamriel to learn, as it's very alien and sounds extremely melodiously. But what's very curious about the language is that Vondhem, the researcher, found that it's very similar in sound to the Ayleid language, but that it doesn't share any words with the Ayleid language. The language of the nymphs sound very similar, but is in fact a very different language. This could mean that either the nymphs are far offspring of the Ayleids, which I personally find not too likely since their language is so different and alien to the people of Tamriel, while other Elvish languages which sort of branched off from the original Elvish language are very similar. Look at my video for the Elvish languages for that. And we know that the language of Nymphs cannot be learned easily by the people of Tamriel, unlike many of the other languages on Tamriel, with the exception of the Argonian language, which is also very hard to learn, as I discussed on my video on that language, which is the Argonian language Gel. I personally suspect that the Nymph language is basically its own thing and that it doesn't share any characteristics with other languages on Tamriel, as it's evolved on its own, because it's a completely separate race of creatures. Hence why it's so hard to learn for other people of Tamriel, just like the Argonian language, which is so separate from all the other languages that it's very hard to learn for any elf, human or Khajiit on Tamriel. Anyway, back to the Nymphs. I personally find it far more likely that the Nymphs somehow heard the Aelid language and created their own language through imitation of the sounds of the Aelid language, but then their language themselves being completely different, but just sounds similarly. I think this is because Nymphs are very shy and solitary creatures, contrary to what many scholars on Tamriel believed prior to Fontainebleau's research. They don't mingle with people or elves, or they don't like to be among civilization at all, and they are very wary of humans or elves, not even showing themselves to the people of Tamriel, unless the Nymphs have a very solid feeling that they can trust an individual. Meaning that they probably hid themselves, but did hear the Aelids and modeled their own language after the same type of sounds. That said, since they are so shy and live in solitary life, Nymphs are very rare and even more rarely seen in places with a lot of population. Rather, they often live in very far off places, apparently often close to the coast, even though in Daggerfall they don't seem to be associated with the sea. They often live in caves and grottos, minding their own business completely and shying away from anyone who finds their homes, which are usually desolate places with a lot of beautiful nature around it, because nature seems to be the most important points of their habitats, and they can often be found on far-off coasts or even deserted tropical islands. Fontainebleau in his research needed to spend 3 months of patient waiting, bringing small gifts and presents for the nymph and posing himself as a non-threatening individual to Ayalea, which is the nymph that he had located and wanted to get into contact with. Until the nymph, who lived in a cave far off the coast of Hammerfell, would finally show herself to him, and only after addressing her in her own language did she open up to him. He describes the nymph as being beautiful and aesthetically perfect, with her smile and laugh being enchanting, but also found her to be extremely wise and knowledgeable. The nymph seemed to have an unrivaled ability to store information and to understand the nature of things, hence why they seemed to love nature so much. The nymph Ayalea had much knowledge of nature and how nature worked, being able to describe to Fontainebleau her own knowledge of the deep woodland and animal inhabitants. Apparently knowing more and knowing things in greater detail than the Bosmer scholars that our researcher had met. She also taught him of flowers and ghosts and of all the creatures inhabiting Tamriel, too small and too timid for mortals to ever see, because nymphs live a very long time, perhaps even being immortal, as they call humans and elves mortals, meaning that they themselves may be immortal and spend their whole lives learning about nature and everything in their surroundings. Fontainebleau describes that Ayalea taught him how to learn again for the very first time, of how to open his mind to all the possibilities of life and not having himself be limited by his own way of thinking. He ends his research by giving the recommendation to anyone who would ever see a nymph to speak to her, as you could learn a lot. Now, the funny thing here is that his research ends with a note from the Imperial University saying, and I quote, "Editor's note. The writer, Fontainebleau, is no longer a scholar at the Imperial University. He deposited this manuscript and disappeared from the civilized world. His current whereabouts are unknown." Yeah, this probably means that he went to live with the nymph and hopelessly fell in love, like the stigma around nymphs. That said, it is actually not recommended to speak to a nymph without preparations like the ones that Fontainebleau took. If you don't know their language and are not extremely careful, nymphs are very dangerous creatures, as they can only be hurt with silver weapons or better, and they are resistant to paralysis and poison, and are able to cast spells that can make you fall asleep and drain your energy. Anyway, so what happened to the nymphs? The simple answer is Bethesda just retconned them, but let's not be that simple. First of all, I have my own theory as to why we haven't seen them since Daggerfall in any of the mainline games, because I think that after Fontainebleau's research, people might have actually turned their head to the value of nymphs, especially since their hair in Daggerfall has alchemical properties, meaning that the nymphs may have been hunted down for both their knowledge, their hair, and yeah, let's call it personal satisfaction. While that isn't too likely, nymph hunts could explain why we can't easily find them anymore in the remaining mainline games, and that the remaining nymphs isolated themselves even more away from any place where no player could ever find them. But then there's the mystery of the Elder Scrolls Online. Why don't we see them there, centuries before Daggerfall and centuries before Von den Barris' research? Well, my friend Nerddragon theorized that perhaps during the Second Era there weren't as many nymphs as in the Third Era, and that perhaps some type of event happened which caused them to procreate more, meaning that they became less rare and thus they were seen more often around the time of Daggerfall, meaning while during the time of the Elder Scrolls Online they are so rare that we don't see them anywhere, or perhaps we will see them in the next chapter as we're apparently going to some mysterious faraway islands, so yeah, maybe we'll see them. But unfortunately that never happened, as that original recording was from around High Isle's launch, the Elder Scrolls Online DLC. We never saw the Nymphs, and I'm assuming that the theory that they are essentially replaced by the Nereids by the developers, which are far more, Elder Scrolls in feeling, that's probably true. Now, having said everything I can about Nereids and Nymphs, let's now talk about another race of elf, the Sea Elf, or Maormer, a race that we hadn't seen in the games until their introduction in the Elder Scrolls Online, despite them having existed in the lore for a very long time. So, the Sea Elves, or Maormer as they call themselves, are a race of elf found to the south of Tamriel, living primarily on the far-off jungle continent of Piandene and on some of the surrounding islands. As a race, they kind of resemble High Elves, except with milky white, almost translucent skins, white eyes and several other fish-like features, with some of them apparently even having gills. Which is kinda weird, but does explain why some High Elves call them the Fish Elves, which is meant as an insult, but I get where they're coming from, considering the looks and, the gills. Now, while we have a pretty decent explanation of why every race on Tamriel looks the way it does, for example with the Dunmer having their grey skin due to a punishment by Azura, we don't exactly know why the Maormer looked like this. Some on Tamriel have speculated that once the common ancestor of all elves, the Aldmer, which is also the ancestor of the Sea Elves, arrived in the tropical jungles of their home continent of Piandene, they started to interbreed with intelligent beast-fish races on the island. While that would give us some explanation for how they look like, the source of this information is quite unreliable, and I would say that it may be anti-Maormer propaganda, so I don't know how reliable it is. In fact, many of the things that we know about the Maormer are pretty unreliable. You see, the Sea Elves have had a long-standing rivalry with the High Elves of the Somerset Isles, being permanently at war with the High Elves as they tried to conquer the Somerset Isles for themselves. This war for the Somerset Isles between the High Elves and the Sea Elves has been going on for literally millennia, and during that time there's been a lot of propaganda going both ways, with the Maormer themselves claiming that they, not the High Elves, are the purest race of elf, and with the High Elves coming up with any kind of dirt on the Sea Elves that they could over the years, which then found its way into a lot of sources that we have, so take a lot of the negative things in this video with a kind of a grain of salt, as it may simply be Altmer propaganda working its way into Tamriel's history books, although in recent years we also have some primary sources from the Maormer, so the picture has become a little bit more nuanced over the years. Now, with that having been said, I think it's a good idea to explain a bit about the Sea Elves' origin, so you have somewhat of an idea of why exactly they hate the High Elves so much, and why the High Elves hate them with almost equal ferocity. You see, once upon a time, the Sea Elves, just like all elves when they were still the Aldmer, the ancestor race to all other elven races on Tamriel, lived on Aldmuris, the legendary home continent of the elves, which according to legends was a large island continent that lay somewhere to the southwest of Tamriel, and in ancient tapestries and texts it's described as one massive elven city that spanned the entire continent after thousands of years of prosperous expansion. Now, that continent, according to legend, eventually came to be abandoned by its inhabitants, who would flee the continent and sail to Tamriel after the continent of Aldmuris was facing a strange and undefined doom, rendering it unlivable for the ancient Aldmer. Now, all that happened in ancient history, but long before any Aldmer had to flee the continent of Aldmuris for the shores of Tamriel to then evolve into the races of elves that we know pretty well, a group of elves already left their ancient homeland of Aldmuris way earlier. And these elves, who left Aldmuris way before the others according to legend, ended up becoming the Sea Elves. The interesting thing here is that they did not leave of their own accord though, they rather were banished. You see, on Aldmuris there was an Altmer nobleman named Orgnum, and he was an extremely rich and influential man. Legends say that he did not really agree with the way the giant city continent was run, and used his wealth to launch a rebellion against the rulers of Aldmuris in these ancient times. But this rebellion would prove to be unsuccessful, as Orgnum and those who followed his rebellion were eventually defeated, and they were then banished from Aldmuris, forced to leave for distant shores. And once their ships had departed, the continent suddenly became surrounded by a magical veil of mist conjured up by the Altmer still on the continent, which prevented them from ever returning and finding the continent again. again, leaving its inhabitants once more in peace and the nobleman Orgnum and his followers exiled on some ships before the coast. Since returning to their homeland was impossible, Orgnum took his fleet and set sail to the east, where he and his followers eventually found the mysterious continent of Piandene, a large island continent covered in jungles, beaches, reefs and inland swamps, inhabited by all kinds of strange and mysterious monsters, and surrounded completely by a mysterious mist. Despite these dangers, Orgnum and his followers made the continent their home, and the nobleman Orgnum then proclaimed himself king over the exiles, who over the years would evolve into the Sea Elves that we know today. Now, something interesting is that while we already talked a bit about some of the theories as to exactly how their looks changed so dramatically from ARTTAiR Elves, which are said to look a bit like High Elves, to the white-skinned Sea Elves with their fish features, while that theory that they interbreeded with the native beast races of Piandene is possible, I personally have a second theory. Specifically, I think that it was Orgnum, now King Orgnum, who transformed his people, using magic in order to adapt them better to their new home continent, as in their current forms they can drink salt water, are extremely nimble in the water and never get seasick. Strangely enough, they can get land sick, which is pretty funny because we see some Maormer actually complaining about having to stand on land instead of a ship or in the sea. Alright, now you see, from all that we know, Orgnum is said to be an extremely powerful and immortal wizard, with some stating that his powers is almost godlike, and some people in Tamriel going even further by proclaiming him to be some aspect of the serpent god Satakal from the Yokudan pantheon. Though that theory of him basically being a god is far from universally accepted, and it's even a blasphemous interpretation for most Redguards who worship Satakal, but it's a possibility. Now, no matter how exactly Orgnum attained his powers, we know that he is an extremely powerful wizard, and his magics have been shown to physically alter some of his people, as you'll see later in this video. So I think it's a pretty good theory that he used his immense power to change his people and adapt them to the treacherous waters and reefs of their new tropical home. Alright, now regardless of whether or not it was Orgnum who changed the Sea Elves' appearance, he is nonetheless an extremely important figure in their society and culture. And I say is, because after all these millennia it's said that he is still very much alive and still leading the Maormer. In fact, he is described as an immortal sorcerer who achieves immortality either through vampirism, strange rituals involving sacrifices, or of course divinity, like we talked about before. In fact, he's not only immortal, but he's also described by those who met him to grow younger every year. How truthful that is we don't exactly know, though we do know that he is very old, and from the very few physical descriptions that we have of him, he doesn't look like he's very old, so there may be some truth to it. Now, while we don't know an awful lot about Orgnum and how he rules his people, we do know that his will and his hatred for the Altmer, who banished him and his people from Altmuris, led him to attack and pillage the Somerset Isles many times throughout history, after the elves who fled Altmuris landed there and made the islands their home, with sometimes less than a year going by without Orgnum leading an attack on the Isles, after they found the High Elves living peacefully on the Somerset Isles, and they really couldn't stand that, as Orgnum still holds the High Elves responsible for his ancient banishment together with his people. His hatred for the High Elves and his desire to conquer the Somerset Isles shapes the Maormer's entire society, with some Maormer who live independent of Orgnum, away from Piandene, describing that his will is almost all that most Maormer live for, as they are fiercely loyal to their deathless king and will do anything to help him achieve his goal of conquering the Somerset Isles. Now, despite millennia of trying, the Maormer and their deathless king never succeeded in conquering the Somerset Isles themselves. While they did conquer some smaller islands south of Tamriel, they never got a significant foothold on the Somerset Isles themselves, and time after time they got rebelled by the forces of the High Elves. What's funny is that there was actually a really short time at the very end of the Second Era during the Tiber Wars, when Tiber Septim tried to reunite the entire continent, when at least some Maormer allied themselves with the Somerset Isles and Valenwood, trying to stop Tiber Septim, as apparently they disliked his empire even more than they disliked the High Elves. Although that alliance quickly fell through when the High Elves left the Sea Elves out to dry when they were attacked by Imperials, and then that alliance was quickly broken, and the attacks on the Somerset Isles would then continue into deep in the Third Era. Now, the last recorded attack under the leadership of Orgnum on the Somerset Isles took place in the year 110 of the Third Era, during the War on the Isles. Then the Maormer threw everything they had at it in order to conquer the Somerset Isles, but this time the High Elves were aided by the Empire's navy and by the Sigic Order, and that combined might was so great that the entire Sea Elf armada sank, and ever since then it's said that the Maormer never again attempted to conquer the Somerset Isles. And it's true that they've been awfully quiet on the war front ever since, though that could also have another myriad of reasons, not the least of which that perhaps the Maormer might have finally gotten rid of Orgnum after such a large defeat and probably being sick of his shit after, well, millennia. Because despite him being extremely powerful and perhaps a god, it's not like his aggressive tendencies towards the High Elf cousins have ever earned him anything more than defeat. And even by the Second Era, there were already Maormer clans and individuals who deserted Orgnum, with a large Maormer fleet that dread sails, simply sailing away during the Second Era and trying to conquer some islands west of Tamriel in an attempt to gain independence from Orgnum. And additionally, in the Elder Scrolls Online, we can see several examples of Maormer who are independent of Orgnum, and once they stopped listening to his hate, or perhaps just stopped falling under some kind of spell of his influence, they no longer carried a specific ill will towards the High Elves other than just disliking them, but definitely no longer willing to throw their lives into a senseless crusade, all because their immortal king has a grudge from thousands of years ago. I'm not saying that it's certain that Orgnum was deposed, or even if it's possible if he's really a god aspect, just saying that we have seen examples where Maormer are suddenly no longer aggressive towards High Elves once they are outside the influence of their deathless king, and that ever since their biggest defeat in history, the Maormer have basically minded their own business. I mean, it's not the craziest idea, it's just speculation, but I think it could be true. Alright. Now, regardless of whether he is still in power or not, we know that Orgnum rules his people in a pretty distant, hands-off manner, because the clans of Piendenay and their independent Maormer privateer fleets have lots of freedom, even politically, as they can ally themselves with almost everyone and act as mercenaries on Tamriel, as long as it benefits Orgnum in the end, although most of them usually resort to piracy and privateering in Orgnum's name, especially against the High Elves. The Maormer even have quite a lot of internal strife on Piendenay, it's said, with internal Maormer negotiations often ending in blood spilled, and even at Orgnum's court it's said that there's a lot of fighting and conflict, and Orgnum doesn't really seem to mind any of it, as long as they all swear personal fealty to him and mobilize when he wants to do one of his Somerset Isles invasions again. Now, we don't know what Piendenay looks like. What I've been showing you is basically artistic interpretation and some footage of jungles. But we do know that on the continent and around it, the Maormer are organized in several clans on the continent and fleets around the continent, which both seem to have their own political independence to a degree within Maormer culture. Some clans are apparently led by princes, while independent fleets are apparently governed by so-called sea lords. They all seem to be somewhat independent, with all of them only being held together by their shared fealty to Orgnum. Now, other than that, there's really not all that much that we know about their culture, but here's some interesting things from what we do know. First of all, they dislike the High Elves. A lot, if that wasn't clear to you yet. While those independent of Orgnum seem to be less aggressive towards them, even they say that they'd rather be locked in a room with a mutineer than with a High Elf, and in their society, having sex with a High Elf is considered treason, and having a relationship with one is considered to be the ultimate taboo and unforgivable, even to some of the independent Maormer. The funny thing is that we actually know that Orgnum himself did have an affair with a High Elf lady at some point, and his Maormer subjects don't seem to mind that. Oh, and by the way, he also had sex with Patema during a political summit where she tried to get his aid in her war against Central Imperial authority. Grand. Now, other than that, we know that they worship several gods. We know that they worship the serpent god Satakal, for example, which could be a hint towards there being a grain of truth to Orgnum's divinity. But they also seem to worship Sirabane, and they acknowledge the Daedra, as we have examples of Maormer Molag Bal and Hermaeus Mora worshippers, though we don't know if they are present in their pantheon at large or not. We also sometimes hear them refer to a deity unique to them, which is called Mother Sea, which seems to be some kind of personification or deity controlling the sea, and as far as I'm aware, isn't worshipped by anyone else. Now, we also know that in battle, especially at sea, the Maormer are extremely effective, with them using gigantic sea serpents that we talked about before on the channel as war beasts and mounts in the water, and using tamed reef vipers as sort of aquatic attack dogs. In battles with other ships on the high seas, they are some of the most feared adversaries, as their storm mages can manipulate the winds to either slow down or straight up push over enemy ships, making them an easy target for Maormer boarding parties on their fast ships, some of which are said to look like gigantic floating insects with membrane-like sails, although they are also known to use more traditional types of ships. When they board enemy ships, the most fearsome boarders of their boarding parties are the so-called Maormer Leviathans, extremely tall Maormer with scaled skins and hunched backs. These Leviathans are very strange beings, as their entire anatomy seems to have been deformed as they became bigger, stronger and more aggressive beings, which even require other Maormer to be kept in check, as otherwise they sometimes randomly start attacking people in a strange aggressive rage. How exactly these Maormer Leviathans came into existence we don't know, though there has been speculation that they are a result of magical interbreeding between Maormer and sea serpents, likely due to King Orkney's mystical serpent magics, which also allowed the Maormer to tame the sea serpents in the first place. Now, this magical ability that Orkney possesses to cross his people with the sea serpents and change their entire being is also the basis for my speculation on that it was Orkney's magic which transformed the ARTTAiR, who were exiled with him, into the current Maormer, who are far more adapted to sea life and life on Pianine. Now, there's a few other things that we know about Maormer society. For one, we know that tattoos have a hefty significance in their society. We also know that getting stranded with someone together on an island or a raft after a shipwreck is considered to be a fate pairing for romance. And we know that they keep small sea creatures as pets, and some clans also seem to revere sea witches as a sort of shaman. Now, and that's basically all the information that we have about the Sea Elves. Now let's talk about another extinct race, an extinct race of humans to be precise, the metallic-skinned humans of Blackmarsh, the Kothringi. The Kothringi humans, just like the Lilmothiit, are one of the extinct races of Blackmarsh. Unlike the Lilmothiit, however, we can actually encounter them in an Elder Scrolls game, in the Elder Scrolls Online. And in addition to that, we also have a lot more solid information on the Kothringi than we do on the Lilmothiit. There's a lot less guessing in them. The story of the Kothringi humans begins back in the Merethic era, back before even the Nereids humans migrated to Tamriel from Maormer, or before the ARTTAiR Elves had landed on Tamriel. Back in these days, Tamriel was inhabited by only a few races, mostly beast races like the Argonians and the Khajiit, but there was actually also a human race native to southern Tamriel, the Kothringi. They lived primarily in Blackmarsh around this time, and they are known to have strange metallic colored skin. These Kothringi humans are most likely descendants of the wandering Elnofey, the far-off ancestors of the human races who got isolated on Tamriel after the Elnofey Wars, and they ended up evolving into this strange metallic-skinned human race. They were very tribally organized and were notoriously underdeveloped compared to their cousins on Atmora and Yokuna. Therefore, their actions have only had a very small impact on the grand scale of things, as they got overshadowed on southern Tamriel by the already existing Khajiit kingdoms and elsewhere, and the Argonian Zenmir society in Blackmarsh. Because the Kothringi society remained in a tribal state for basically the most of its existence, while other races such as the Argonians and the Khajiit, but later also the Elves and the Nereids, developed their own societies, the Kothringi remained tribal, with little organized elements in their society. This caused their society to be relatively small and underdeveloped for most of its history. Most of the lore that we do have on their tribes before the Roman Empire took over Blackmarsh pertains to their tribal way of life. For example, in previously established lore it's mentioned a few times how the Kothringi preferred to live without clothes, living their lives naked unless traveling to other cultures. We don't know whether they just removed this part of the lore, as in the Elder Scrolls Online we can still encounter a surviving Kothringi tribe who mostly wears simple tribal garbs. Or if it's just this simple tribe that actually wears garbs, or if they just removed it at all. The Kothringi mostly lived in simple villages made out of simple huts with thatched roofs, with tribal totems dotting their villages, as we can see in the Elder Scrolls Online. The tribes have a very traditional tribal structure, as they are usually headed by a chieftain, who is aided by a shaman in religious matters, and a war chief in matters of war. They are, as far as we know, the original worshippers of Ze'en, the god of toil, and it's said that the Kothringi sailors and fishermen were the ones who spread the worship of this god around southern Tamriel, most notably Valenwood. Next to Ze'en, their pantheon of gods is largely unknown, but we do know that it consists of both Aedra and Daedra, since Clavicus Vile is part of the pantheon. Next to Ze'en and Clavicus Vile, we also know from out-of-game texts that they worship three gods called the Mothers of the Around Us, which consists out of Mara, Dibe and Keen. The latter two of which are aspects of Dibella and Kinneret, and of course Mara is the first one, but it's called Mara. But these are claims made by out-of-game texts, not officially released by Bethesda, so do take them with a grain of salt. That said, only in the tail end of their existence they started to partially develop and organize when the Roman Empire took over the province of Blackmarsh. During this period they helped the Roman Empire occupy the province and held administration over some significant cities, and provided soldier garrisons to several cities. Some Kothringi actually held a quite distinguished position within the Empire, as a Kothringi named Zook was a guard to Riemann III's wife and helped actually in the assassination of Riemann III. Under the Riemann Empire they may have prospered for a short period of time, but unfortunately almost all of their society was completely wiped out by the Carnarvon flu, which raced through the province of Blackmarsh during the late middle of the Second Era. Their society completely collapsed, and within a few years their society had almost been completely wiped out, and by the year 583 of the Second Era, the year the Elder Scrolls Online takes place in, there's almost nothing left of their society. A few Kothringi survived, most notably the tribe living in Stillrise village. They were cursed with immortality by Clavicus Vile and thus surviving the flu, but I talked about that topic extensively in my video on the curse of Stillrise village. So, if you wish to know more about either Stillrise village, which houses the largest band of surviving Kothringi, or you wish to know more about the Carnarvon flu that I talked about, the disease that completely wiped their society out, just as it did the Lilmothiit society, I recommend you watch my video on that topic. While I'd love to talk about these topics here, I'd be repeating myself, and I could not talk about those topics in the same details as I can there, so if you wish to know more, they're only like 2 clicks away, so I'll leave links in the description and in the eye icons above. But for this video it's time to move on, as next up we've got a very curious race that has existed in the lore since some of the earlier games in the series, and has some pretty hilarious lore: the intelligent ape man of Valenwood, the Imga. So, the Imga, an obscure beast race that lives primarily in the jungles of Valenwood. They're intelligent ape men who live in both the treetops, in old elvish and human ruins across the province, and in the Bosmer cities in Valenwood's great Grad Oaks, where they live together with the Bosmer. They're said to have been Valenwood's original beast race that was there long before any elvish race set foot on Tamriel, so even before the Bosmer. They are described to look like a mix between large apes and a human with thick fur, being even taller than most high elves. This description has led to some people on Tamriel, especially people who live far away from Valenwood, to suggest that the Imga might not actually exist, but that the reports of them are instead just racist depictions of wood elves. However, that's not the case, as we have several first and second hand accounts of the Imga actually existing, including a few Bosmer who speak of having seen them or having lived with them, so we know that they do exist. Now, while the Imga have been described as an intelligent ape-man beast race with excellent hand-eye coordination and agility, we do know that their intelligence seems to be slightly lower than that of the playable races. While they do have a functioning society, that society seems to be very tribal in its structure, and they don't really claim any land to be theirs, instead they just live wherever they are. They don't build anything, they simply live in the trees and in the buildings that are left behind by other races. They also don't seem to be able to craft advanced weapons, only being able to craft simple tools, although they are able to use weaponry, because as we will get into, they will sometimes use weapons made by the other races. They're able to cook, but their dishes are said to be very simple. They make musical instruments, but those again are very simple ones like drums. So while definitely a step down in terms of advancement and intelligence compared to the other playable races, but they're definitely not just some race of animal, as some in the community seem to suggest. Now, in terms of interaction with the other races, we do know that they have some respect for the Bosmer, and they tend to live together with the Bosmer in several big Bosmer tree cities, where the Imga then live in the treetops and are part of the city's ecosystem. Some unlicensed, out-of-game texts of ex-developers that they wrote after leaving Bethesda suggest that some Bosmer don't really like the Imga, but that seems to be a bit contradictory to everything else that we know, so I don't put much faith in it. But it does mean that there is a possibility that in some places across Valenwood, the Imga and the Bosmer may be in conflict or just not that fond of one another. Now, one race that they definitely don't want conflict with is the High Elves. Some of the more humorous descriptions of the Imga say that they idolize High Elves to an almost absurd degree. It's said that they see the High Elves as the pinnacle of society and what they should strive to be. Therefore, many Imga are said to see High Elves as their superiors and treat them with extreme respect, and they try to imitate the High Elves in many ways, as they strive to be like them. For example, it's said that they wear capes in imitation of High Elves. They also try to copy High Elf speech patterns, which actually sounds kinda clumsy, and they try to practice with High Elf weapons. They also give each other ridiculous, extravagant titles, which don't really mean anything, as other than their chieftains, they don't really seem to have any formal societal structure. They also try to imitate the High Elves when it comes to their behavior, as they pretend to really hate humans and perfume the edges of their capes that they wear so that they can hold them to their nose when a human walks by in order not to smell them, as the Imga believe that humans have a putrid smell, probably due to hearing that from the High Elves, as usually Imga don't really have any contact with humans. Also, in very extreme circumstances where Imga tried to imitate the High Elves, some are said to completely shave off their fur, then powder their skin to look more like High Elves. The description that we have says that they are too clumsy to do this properly though, and they then cut themselves in the process, creating a, and I quote from the source material here, pathetic picture of a shaved ape with skin dotted with bloody cuts. This is obviously pretty pathetic, but in the lore after the Elder Scrolls Redguard, where that depiction originates from, it's been suggested that far from all Imga do stuff like that, with most of them simply dwelling in the trees and in the ruins in Valenwood, just living their best life. It's not to say that not all Imga respect High Elf culture and strive to be like it, it's just that they don't all shave themselves and do that kind of thing. Because in the Elder Scrolls Online, the Imga were planned to appear, but cut pretty late in development. While we don't seem to have any character models data mined, so we don't really know what the Imga look like except for these two images, data miners did find that one of the quests would have been to go on a scavenger treasure hunt with an Imga tribe, where they tried to find some, likely High Elf, cutlery, which they apparently saw as a big treasure. That said, cut content also gives us an insight into the names of Imga, as they're pretty primitive, almost caveman-like. We know that 2 elders or chieftains were planned to be in the game, with one named Knonk and the other Brump, and then we have 3 other Imga names that I could find, being Fush, Whom and Wood. Unfortunately, that content was cut, but even if it was there, the Imga would just likely have played a very small role, probably just appearing for a few quests. As the Elder Scrolls Online takes place in a time of great conflict, and the Imga are said to always hide themselves in the deepest part of the jungle when there's war, in order not to become collateral damage. They then probably re-emerge once again to once more live their best lives in the jungle when there's peace. However, there have been suggestions that the walking city of Falanesti, which is also absent from the Elder Scrolls Online, houses a pretty big Imga colony. And that city has been teased a couple of times for the Elder Scrolls Online, so perhaps, just maybe, we might see them in the next few years. In which case I'll make another video on them. By the way, if you're interested in that walking city that I just talked about, a video on the walking city of Falanesti is in the description of this video. Now, something interesting to note here is that while so far I, and basically any other lore video that I found online, portrayed them as some sort of illiterate cavemen who aren't at all that intelligent, that might not really be necessarily the case. Let me explain. We have 2 Imga in history who we know have been a lot smarter than most videos portray them to be, so perhaps their intelligence gap has just been exaggerated, or perhaps they're just as intelligent as the other races in terms of potential, but they just haven't been educated, as they just live in tribes. Let me explain. We have 2 Imga, one that we know could read and write, and the other was a very powerful necromancer. The Necromancer is an unnamed Imga who managed to become a Lich, which is an extremely complicated process only very accomplished necromancers can even hope to achieve, and this Imga then managed to temporarily become the tyrannical ruler of a small city before being defeated. And the second Imga that we know of to have been far more intelligent than the stereotype that we know is the Prophet Maruk, an Imga from the First Era who wrote down the Alessian doctrines after supposedly getting a vision of Saint Alessia. His writings were the original inspiration for the radical movement called the Alessian Order, which would go on to try and make ARTTAiR the one true divine. The radicals of the order named themselves after the Prophet Maruk, naming themselves the Marukati Selectives. Now, we don't know for how long the Prophet Maruk lived, but we do know that his writings would change the First Cyrillic Empire and Tamriel forever. I mean, as the person inspiring the Alessian Order, he is definitely in the top 50, if not top 30 or 20 of the most important people in Tamriel's history, considering what the Order would go on to do, which we'll cover in a future video on the Alessian Order. So, based on that, we cannot really say that all Imga are of low intelligence. Like I said, perhaps they're just extremely uneducated and they just enjoy a more carefree existence in the jungle, who knows. But to say that all Imga are of low intelligence would likely be very misleading, considering some of the examples that we do have. Now, that being said, I truly do wonder if we will ever see Imga in any of the games. While in the lore for the Elder Scrolls Redguard, they were made to seem like basically another prominent beast race, for example with them being described in the same sentence as Argonian and Khajiit in some cases, they have been made far less prominent since Morrowind, with, according to some people, that being likely because Bethesda thought that they might have been a bit offensive as a creature. While I couldn't find a source for that, I kinda get where they're coming from considering some of the stuff that we talked about before in this video, but that's not to say that they've been retconned, because that they absolutely have not been, because in the last Elder Scrolls Online expansion, Gold Road, once again they have been referenced, and they have been consistently referenced in the other games and in the Elder Scrolls Online throughout the years, so they're still there, they just haven't been shown yet, so hey, perhaps one day. So, now that we've talked about the Imga, let's talk about another race that a lot of people may have never heard about, the Sea Giants. While regular giants are quite well known, the Sea Giants are far less so. They are a more intelligent version of the giants from the far north, and their story is quite interesting. So, the Sea Giant, a presumed distant cousin of Skyrim's regular giant, is a curious case. For one, they are much more intelligent than Skyrim's regular giants, as they are able to master multiple languages next to their own and are far more advanced craftsmen. While giants in Skyrim are quite primitive, the Sea Giants are able to build longships and create advanced tools, and they are even able to use a limited degree of magic. Further differences with their land cousins on Skyrim's tundras are that they have blue silvery skin and are even more resistant to the cold than regular giants. And unlike normal giants, Sea Giants are mostly creatures of legends, as not many have actually seen them during their lifetime. You see, Sea Giants, as their name suggests, live on longboats in the Sea of Ghosts for most of the year, and they very rarely make landfall on Tamriel. Only once every few years, small contingents of Sea Giants will make land on Tamriel, and it's even rarer for large groups to make landfall. When they do make landfall, it's often during very cold winters that even they cannot weather, and they often raid Nordic coastal villages if they come en masse, which they have done a few times. And if they come with really big groups, they often raid bigger cities on the northern coasts like Solitude, Dawnstar and Winterhold. Although that happens so rarely that most Nords don't even tend to believe in the Sea Giants' existence, and see them as creatures of legends and fairy tales which do not actually exist and are just, present in stories to scare children. But they very much do exist, as like I said, they have raided Skyrim's northern coast semi-regularly during its history, and in the lore that we have it says that the legends of Sea Giants on Tamriel's northern coasts started around the middle of the First Era, which actually provides somewhat of a hint of where they could live, but I'll get to that in a bit, because you see, the sources that we have, which are all written by Tamrielic peoples by the way, tell us that Sea Giants live on their gigantic longboats all year around and do not make landfall unless it's so cold that even they cannot go on sailing and the sea freezes around them. The people of Tamriel presume that the Sea Giants on their ships, which they allegedly live on all year round, feed themselves by hunting the whales of the Northern Sea, and the extreme cold of the Northern Sea of Ghosts doesn't bother them that much because of their extreme cold resistance, meaning that as long as they keep themselves fed with whale meat and presumably are able to drink salt water, I guess, they can keep themselves going indefinitely at sea. But I personally have a different theory based on some evidence, because considering that we know that the continent of ARTTAiR, which froze over and became completely unlivable for regular humans despite being the original home continent of most races of humans, that continent is in the north of the Sea of Ghosts, and that continent also allegedly had giants. And the story of Sea Giants started appearing for the first time in the middle of the First Era, when ARTTAiR had semi-just frozen. There's a strong chance that their main population, so the main population of Sea Giants, lives on ARTTAiR's coasts, being able to weather the cold due to their extreme cold resistance and being able to live off the fish that they catch near the coasts. This also means that they could get non-salt water by melting ARTTAiR's land snow and ice, solving that problem. Another strong indicator of them living in a place which at least used to be inhabited by humans is that in their raiding parties they bring a lot, and I mean a lot, of half-giants, which allegedly came about due to their breeding with humans. Considering how rare sightings of Sea Giants are on northern Skyrim, and thus not many Nords who have even seen them, and even less who would be able to breed with them, and even less who would have wanted that, it would make sense that these half-giants, which seem to have inherited the cold resistance of the actual Sea Giants, are probably the long-time descendants of those humans who on ARTTAiR breeded with these giants, leading to the half-Sea Giants long before ARTTAiR froze over. Or perhaps just as ARTTAiR was freezing over, just, to give their own descendants a chance. But again, it all makes sense to me, but that's my speculation, since the only actual lore that we have is that they live all year round on their longboats. But that doesn't really make much sense to me personally, if only because of the salt water thing. So yeah, it's likely that they may live on ARTTAiR, or at least what's left of ARTTAiR, and likely then on ARTTair's coast, considering that they mostly feed themselves with whales, and nothing grows anymore on frozen ARTTair. That being said, due to their seafaring nature, they do spend a lot of time at sea and on the coasts. This can also be seen in their tools and in their clothes, as much of it is made with whalebone, horker hides, whale skin, and the large scales of a weird and unidentified sea creature that they seem to catch, although nobody on Tamriel seems to know what kind of creature those scales are on. But to get an idea, maybe watch my video on Tamriel's sea monsters for an idea of what kind of creature that possibly could be. But more importantly, their tools, being mostly made out of materials gathered while hunting out at sea, shows that they have very little land resources to work with. In fact, when they raid Skyrim's most northern villages, they seem to rarely take any valuables. They mostly take wood, metal and other building materials that are probably really hard to come by wherever they live when they are off their ships, be it just the high seas on their ships all the time or at Mora like I speculated. Because they need these materials to maintain their longboats, as repairing your boat with whalebone might not be the best material to keep them floating. Now, considering that they also attack Nordic ships when they encounter them on the Sea of Ghosts, because Nordic sailors say that if you are a witness to seeing a sea giant, you won't survive to tell the tale, it's likely that they also repurpose the materials of enemy ships that they, destroy to repair their own ships, trying to be as creative as they can with the little materials that they have. Strangely enough, it's even said that their weapons, especially harpoons, which are made out of whalebone, are of quite high quality, and that according to some on Tamriel, they are of better quality and they are lighter than some metal weapons on Tamriel, which is a pretty cool lore tidbit. Now it also seems that they are organized relatively primitively. They have chiefs, so they mostly likely live in really small communities like the orcs, although they also have titles like captain when on the high sea, so they might be more organized. We don't really know anything about the organization of their culture other than that the half-giants do seem to be always subservient to the actual sea giants, as they are usually seen serving the sea giants rather than a sea giant serving a half-giant. So that's basically what we know about their culture. That being said, earlier in the video I spoke about their language, which I couldn't find much of in the lore resources in the game, but the UESP have actually compiled all the voice lines in their native language that we have, and they try to make sense of what their language is like. They discovered that their language shares some words with the language of regular giants, but is quite different overall, which actually makes sense considering how many generations these two distant cousin species have spent apart, if of course they are from Mora. Now, we also know that during our playtime in the Elder Scrolls Online there are a few places where we can encounter them, suggesting that the year 582 of the Second Era, when Elder Scrolls Online takes place, is a pretty cold year. As expected, we can find them raiding some villages along the very northern coast. We don't really know whether or not the sea giants became extinct by later eras, because in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim we don't see them anywhere, but considering that in the lore they only make landfall on Tamriel once in a few decades, it's pretty likely that they are still around, but they just aren't there that year and it's not a particularly cold year. Alright, and that was basically everything I can say about the sea giants. Now let's take another step away from Tamriel and talk about another extinct type of elf, the Lefthanded or Sinistral elves of the sunken continent of Yokuda, who are both interesting and a bit controversial in the lore. Now, in my original video on them I talked a lot about their home continent, Yokuda, and my own speculations about that continent, but that didn't really fit in this big collection, so be sure to watch the original video if you want to see me ramble about Yokuda. But now let's only talk about the Lefthanded elves. So, the Lefthanded Elves, also called the Sinistral Elves or Sinistral Mer, were a race of elf which lived in the Merethic and possibly early First Era on the continent of Yokuda, far to the west of Tamriel. They shared this continent with a race of humans, whom we now call the Yokudans, a darker skinned race of human which after their exodus to Tamriel and after their settling in Hammerfell would come to be known as the Redguards. Now, since time immemorial, the Lefthanded Elves had ruled over Yokuda, their empire spanning across almost the entire continent, which back then was said to have been nearly 4 times the size of Tamriel. In their empire they built large and impressive structures, among which was the legendary ARTTAiR Tower of Yokuda, and temples made out of gypsum alabaster, which was kind of their signature material to build out of. It's said that at this time the Yokudan humans suffered heavily under the Lefthanded Elves' rule. How exactly the humans suffered, we don't know. It could be anything ranging from slavery, which would happen to the humans living under Aelid rule in Cyrodiil, or they could have been second-class citizens, like humans living under the Durrani Elves in High Rock. While we don't know exactly how the Yokudan humans suffered under their rule, we do know that they lived together for a while, leading to at least some aspects of Lefthanded Elf language blending into the Yokudan language, which is how scholars on Tamriel are able to translate some of their texts. Now, we don't know how their empire was ruled, whether it was a centralized empire under one left-handed elf emperor, or a group of smaller states banding together and calling themselves an empire, like the Ayleid Empire. But we do know that their empire eventually fell after the Yukudan humans started and eventually won a more than 1000-year war against the left-handed elves, which ended somewhere in the early First Era. After centuries of suffering under their rule, Yukudan humans quote-unquote drove the left-handed elves into the sea after destroying their empire and slaughtering thousands, allegedly with the help of Yukudan gods who provided the Yukudans with legendary orichalk weapons, which then led to the downfall of the left-handed empire. This means that the mighty Left-Hand Empire that spanned the continent in the Merethic era was almost completely destroyed by the beginning of the First Era, with only remnants of their society being left on smaller islands around Yukuda, which eventually were also hunted down and killed by the Yukudan humans. Because due to the quote-unquote suffering under the Left-Handed Elves' rule, the Yukudan humans had a real hatred for these elves, which is why they hunted them down and killed them with such tenacity. Although this did not spell the complete end for the Left-Handed Elf society, as some of the elves had fled east during the war against the Yukudans and had settled on the Sisters Isles, halfway between Tamriel and Yukuda. They tried to conquer these islands in a bloody war against the Tamrielic druids who had settled there, with their conquest ultimately being stopped by a large volcanic eruption which ended their war against the natives and made it so that only a very small number of Left-Handed Elves remained on the island after the eruption, which were then in turn wiped out a few years later by the migrating Yukudans who had fled away from the now sinking Yukuda and found these remnants of their ancient enemies on the islands in their way towards Tamriel, and thus they killed them. I mean, the Yukudans had such an intense hatred for the Left-Handed Elves that they immediately killed basically anything that looked like an elf, killing whole settlements of elves along Hammerfell's coast as they landed on Tamriel, without the option for them to surrender. And I mean, these were Tamrielic elves, they had nothing to do with the Left-Handed Elves, but they were still just killed because they looked like elves. They just really didn't like elves. Now, while we have no idea what the Left-Handed Elves looked like, most in the community, me included, have speculated that just like the Red Guards, they most likely had a darker skin tone, and a few pieces of the fan art that we find online give them this red hair for some reason. I don't really know why. It seems to be an artistic choice of the very few artists who made art from Left-Handed Elves, as we don't have a source for their hair color, but hey, I like it. Just know there's no source for the red hair. Now, something we do know, however, is that they use snakes in their iconography and in their decoration of their weapons and armor. It's said that they primarily fought defensively, making heavy use of shields, something which the ancient traditional Yukudans rarely did. We also know that they're crafted using a rare greenish cyan metal called chrysocolla, which is a metal originating from Yukuda, which the Left-Handed Elves seem to primarily use. And they also seem to primarily use the onyx as a gem to craft with, as that was the primary gem type that they mined for until the Yukudans overran and conquered their mines. They may have also been the original inventors of Singer Steel, a type of steel that the Red Guards claim to have been their invention on Yukuda, which is steel mixed with orichalk, but there is evidence for the Left-Handed Elves to have also crafted with this material as well, perhaps even before the ancient Yukudans did so. We don't know who invented it, but it's a possibility. Something else that we know about them is that the Left-Handed Elves believe that not the head, but rather a person's abdomen was the housing for their soul, which is pretty interesting. And they, or at least a faction of Left-Handed Elves, had a very peculiar system of death beliefs. Specifically, they believe that nothing awaits them in an afterlife. You see, while many races and cultures believe in some form of afterlife, be it a neutral afterlife for your soul in Aetherius, or like the Nords believe, if you die an honorable death in battle, you may feast forever in Sovngarde, the Left-Handed Elves, or at least a faction of them, seem to have believed that there would be nothing in the afterlife. They seem to have seen the traditions of Yukudan humans, which relied on honor giving you a better afterlife, as a gentle lie. Specifically, they believed that the Yukudan humans also knew that there was nothing after death, but that they just lied to themselves that honor would give them an afterlife in order not to have to accept that nothing awaited them in the afterlife, bringing themselves comfort when there is none, because there is no comfort after death, or at least that's what these Left-Handed Elves believe. And as such, the Left-Handed Elves did not believe in honor, at least not the type of honor that you adhere to in order to influence what kind of afterlife you get. And they believed that knowing that there would be no afterlife would make their people stronger, as it would encourage them to live in the present rather than living honorably for a better afterlife. This is pretty interesting, as it's unlike most other religions and death beliefs on Tamriel, as most races at least believe that there is some type of afterlife. Now, something interesting to note here is that this source also reveals that the Left-Handed Elves may have called themselves the Kanoyai, which is a name that might be the name that the Left-Handed Elves called themselves. However, this source may have described the specific faction or tribe's beliefs, you know, that stuff about nothing being there in the afterlife. So what I said about death may not apply to all Left-Handed Elves, and what I said about their name may also just be the name of a very specific section or religious cult of their population, so keep that in mind. I see a lot of people saying that Kanuriai is basically just the name that the Left-Handed Elves gave to themselves, but the source itself doesn't really describe that. It just says that we Kanuriai believe this. Which does mean that it might be a specific sect of priests, or it might be a specific faction, or anything like that. But keep it in mind. And that was basically everything I can say about the Left-Handed Elves specifically. Now again, if you want to see my whole Yokuda speculation, watch my original video on the Left-Handed Elves. Now next up, let us talk about another intelligent type of beast race that we are not even fully sure existed, but is still interesting to talk about, the mysterious Birdmen of Tamriel. And I say mysterious because they are by far one of the most obscure types of beastmen. So, let's talk about it. So, the Birdmen of Cyrodiil. We know very little about this supposed intelligent bird race, which went extinct likely around the middle of the Merethic era, at least 3000 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, and at least 2000 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, although it's possible that it's even older than that, since time in the Merethic era wasn't recorded particularly well. This gives us a bit of a problem with the information that we do have, since the Elder Scrolls lore is full of unreliable narrators, and the information that we do have stems from second to third to even fourth hand sources from at least over 2000 years ago. Because of this, we can say that the information that we do have can be classified as quite unreliable. I'm willing to go so far as to say that it's quite likely that every bit of solid information I'm giving you in this video, which all comes from official sources but is designed to be unreliable, is likely inaccurate because of the unreliable narrator in the sources, which are made to represent something which happened 2,000-3,000 years ago, maybe even longer. So yeah, that being said, the sources that we do have tell us of a beast folk race of birdmen living in the heartland of Cyrodiil, on the Isles of Lake Rumer, including the large Imperial Isle on which the Imperial city would be built thousands of years later. They supposedly also had holdings in the forest around Lake Rumer, making this their supposed territory. Now, we have sources telling us that these bird people were relatively primitive and could not read or write, not having mastered any system of writing. They were also likely living in a tribal society made up of multiple smaller communities. Now, the one source that we have which directly describes them is the account of Topol the Pilot's explorations. He was one of the earliest elves to explore Tamriel after the migrations of the elves, and in essence the elf who discovered Tamriel. I made a video about him. If you want to know more about him, the link to that is in the description. Anyway, the account of his travels described these bird people as having talons instead of feet, and having colorful feathers all over their body, a bit like a human-sized tropical parrot. I kind of imagine them as the Rito from the Legend of Zelda series, or as this apparently generated image that someone posted online of a birdman with parrot-like colored feathers. Anyway, just like parrots in our world mimic our language without really understanding it, the birdmen apparently mimic the Elvish language without understanding it, as they came into contact with Topol the Pilot and his sailors. However, it turned out that they were on a similar intelligence level as man, mer and beastfolk, as according to the account of Topol's travels, they were able to master the Elvish language quickly and soon were able to both read and write, as Topol and his sailors took the time to teach them. According to the legend, this gift of literacy that Topol and his sailors gave to the birdmen caused the birdmen of the Isles of Lake Rumer, the only community that Topol encountered, to proclaim Topol as their lord, and they gave him the Isles, including the Imperial city's Isle, to be his domain. Now, in-universe scholars acknowledge that this mention that they get in Topol's travels is actually the only place in Tamrielic history where these birdmen got mentioned, directly at least. This leads to in-universe, so in the game universe, scholars debating whether these birdmen actually existed or were a fabrication of the writer of the account of Topol's journey, who is said to be in-universe to be quite unreliable. Now, the in-universe scholars who think that the birdmen truly existed speculate that the birdmen were either completely killed off by the early Khajiit, who were in their early 16 Kingdoms period at the time and were much more powerful back then and held large parts of Cyrodiil. The in-universe theory then states that the Khajiit likely killed them in an attempt at more conquest of Cyrodiil to gain more land. Now, The other in-universe theory which some people in the lore mention is that these birdmen, if they existed, were among the first races enslaved by the Ayleids, or the Wild Elves, as they established their first colonies on Tamriel, which would lead to their race slowly dying out as they were all enslaved and eventually killed by the Ayleids, whose kingdoms and eventual empire were largely built upon the enslavement of creatures that they saw as lesser. So these are the theories of in-universe scholars, but I have some other theories for you as well. Because one theory that I've seen states that it was simply a tribe of either early humans, akin to the Kothringi, a video on them is in the description as well if you want to know more, or another race of elves who were living in the Heartland who, like the Ayleids after them, used bird feathers to decorate their armor and helms. The Ayleids would have copied this custom from them, according to this theory, but then enslaved the original race and killed them off, or assimilating them to such a degree in their own civilization that they eventually became the Ayleids as well. If it was another race of elves, that is, so if they were able to mingle to that degree. These birdmen would then have been the original Wild Elves, if they were elves, before the Ayleids would take that title from them and became the Wild Elves in recorded history. That would actually make sense, since the Ayleids weren't particularly wild for most of their existence, so that might be the origin of the name Wild Elves. Another option is that Topol the pilot and his sailors actually met the Sarpa Argonians, who are a type of Argonian which is said to have wings. We have not seen this type of Argonian in any of the games, and according to the lore they only live in the deepest parts of the swamp apparently, but it's possible that they had far greater numbers and lived in the heartlands of Cyrodiil before the coming and colonization of Tamriel by the elves and the human races. A final option, which is equally possible but I personally deem less likely, is that the story of Topol is in fact a wildly exaggerated tale. That he was not the first elf to set foot on Tamriel, but that he was someone who lived around the time of the great migrations from the Somerset Isles to Tamriel by the elves. He then found a group of ARTTAiR that had travelled to the Heartlands to settle there, who would eventually become the Ayleids. They were then still scattered and not having formed kingdoms yet, likely living in tents as, you know, they just migrated, and then to demean them, described them as illiterate beasts to the homeland to make fun of the elves who decided to leave their isles. I deem this less likely because the story of Topol being the first elf to set foot on Tamriel and discovering the continent in a way is among most cultures considered to be true, but I mean, unreliable narrator, plus it's a source that is anywhere from 2 to 3,000 to even older in the universe, so it's very possible that Topol may not have been the first and just went to the continent to see what had become of the elves who left the Somerset Isles and then, you know, wrote some demeaning things trying to make them seem as beasts. I mean, we don't know. With a source like this, everything is possible. It's also possible that they met harpies or early harpies who were said to be more intelligent earlier in their existence and have devolved over time, but their origins are said to be Daedric and in the First Era, but that may also be unreliable narrator at work, as we've never had a game set in the First Era, so we don't actually witness that, so the origins of harpies may even be misrepresented. But something that we do know is that some in-universe scholars take the existence of Cyrodiil's birdmen seriously, and during the Second Era, the antiquarian cycle, you know, the people who make comments on the antiquities you dig up in the Elder Scrolls Online, actually came into possession of a skull, which some say could have been one of the birdmen, but other scholars say that it's just a skull of a terror bird, making fun of the scholars who believe that it's actually one of the birdmen. This indicates that it's likely only a minority of scholars who actually believe in their existence, but we don't really know. I mean, where are you on the spectrum of whether they were real or not? Tell me in the comments, please. I want to know. Because personally, I don't really know whether or not they existed. As you've seen in this video, there were far more beast races on Tamriel than we generally know. So I can see them having existed, but to be fair, we don't really know. Alright, now with that behind us, let us take another step away from Tamriel to the continent of Akavir, where 4 intelligent races dominate the continent as far as we know. So, the final couple of races in this video, I will talk about some of the races of Akavir, featuring my friend Zith, who has his own channel where he sometimes does Elder Scrolls lore, so be sure to check him out. And with that said, let's talk about the races of Akavir now. Before we begin, it's crucial for me to elaborate upon the role that Akavir plays in the Elder Scrolls lore. The name Akavir translates directly into Dragonland in several languages in the Elder Scrolls universe. The continent itself is a large landmass located just across the Padomaic Ocean, east of Tamriel. We don't exactly see the geography of the continent in any of the games, so we don't know what the continent looks like. So what you'll see in this video is almost all fan interpretations, especially when it comes to maps. Since Akavir is a place that we haven't really been yet in any of the games, and I personally don't really think that we'll be going there anytime in the future, so we're just relying on descriptions that we have in the lore here. Anyway, both the races of Tamriel and Akavir have attempted to invade each other at several points through history, and one could say that there are centuries of conflict between the races of the two continents. Yet much of what we know about these invading forces from Akavir is either incomplete in the lore or it's all forgotten by our playtimes. Now I'm saying this because of the fact that the inhabitants of Tamriel have little to no evidence of the true physical and mental characteristics of the races of Akavir, even though they were on Tamriel and they invaded Tamriel, and some of them even lived on Tamriel for years. However, by our playtimes, almost all of the proof of their existence on Tamriel is wiped out by the course of history, although we do know a little bit of their appearance, as there are still Akaviri relics of the past on Tamriel, such as the Dragon Guard temples that are still left standing well into the 4th era, but we'll get into that later into the video. In addition to all that, only a very small amount of people on Tamriel have ever even dared to cross the Padomaic Ocean to visit Akavir itself, and this is most likely due to the stories that people heard regarding all of the races that inhabit it, as they mostly seem pretty fearsome. The last person that we know of that at least attempted to make the trip was the Nereids, the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind's hero, and this was done after the defeat of Dagoth-Ur in the 3rd era. Another thing to note in terms of the aversion that mankind in particular has towards the continent of Akavir is the fact that it's believed that men used to live there, but that they were eaten by a rivaling race called the Sesi, which completely eradicated the presence of mankind on Akavir alone. Now, the term eaten here should be taken with a really big grain of salt, because it could mean anything from actually being eaten to other implications like them being enslaved or assimilated into the race. Because we know that Sesi, who came to Tamriel at some point, can actually procreate with mankind. So we don't actually know how the Sesi eating the men of Akavir actually happened. And there's also a little bit of a doubt whether the men of Akavir were actually a thing or whether they were just a legend, or maybe the Sesi were the men of Akavir. But that's all speculation and left vague in the lore. What we do know, however, is that it's very unlikely that there's actually still men on Akavir, so humans on Akavir. We know for a fact that goblins were also spotted on Akavir, and that their fate was similar to that of man, but goblins were predominantly enslaved and used for their blood on Akavir. As far as we know, elves on the other hand are never really a defining colony on the continent of Akavir, and we never hear anything about it. Although if you watch my video on the Sesi, you'll see that I have a theory on their possible influence on Akavir, but you'll have to watch that, because the Sesi is Mr. Sith's territory here in this video. Now, moving on, we do know that there were 5 races that we're actually sure of that lived on Akavir at some point in the past. But as of the 4th era, it said that only 4 dominant races now make up the population of the continent, as one of them was actually wiped out. This is not counting the humans of Akavir, which are still very much in the realm of speculation. We don't know exactly what their status is, as I said before. Now, it's very possible, of course, that there could be other races of intelligent creatures on Akavir, mainly because some of the earlier documented encounters that the inhabitants of Tamriel had with Akavir suggest that they've seen people with rat-like features and other with canine features, a bit like the Khajiit, wandering around the continent, but we never really get elaboration on those races in the lore, and we don't even know whether they were real or just something that the early explorers made up. Regardless, the ones that we do know exist are the main leading races of the 4 nations currently that we know of occupying the continent of Akavir. The 5th race that used to inhabit Akavir were the dragons, and they're all gone from Akavir as far as we know. Now, the interesting thing here is that we know that Akavir is called the Dragonland because dragons used to be indigenous to the continent. But now they're all gone, and this part of the lore is a bit weird and a bit contradictory, as some sources state that the Sesi enslaved a lot of them and consumed a lot of them, and some dragons also fled to other regions in Akavir, such as Potun, which we'll talk about later, and that even other dragons just completely fled the continent and migrated to either ARTTAiR or Tamriel. And this is all supposed to be taking place during the very earliest stages of the Merethic era, so that's how continents like ARTTAiR and Tamriel ended up with a dragon population, according to legends, but we don't really have any non-shaky sources on this subject. This could mean multiple things, but what we know surely is that the Saci put up such a fight that they essentially forced the dragons off the continent altogether. And this brings me to the next race that we need to explain, the Saci. And as I've already said before, I made a video on the Saci myself at some point, so I'm not going to talk about it again on the channel, of course. So that's why I'll have my buddy Sith, who also has his own Elder Scrolls lore channel, take it from here and give me his take on the Saci.
The Saci are a race of vampiric serpent-like folk who have contradicting claims about their appearance. Their appearance has been described as many things, some claiming they're completely human or even snake-like, and others saying that they possess physical attributes of both men and snakes, which would mean they have a human upper body and serpentine lower body extremities. A certain theory even goes into the topic of them being shapeshifters, which might make more sense later in this discussion. They are also very adept at harnessing magic and utilizing it effectively, also utilizing a form of special magic called kiai, which are similar to shouts from the Nordic Thu'um. After thriving untouched from outer forces for thousands of years on Akavir, the Saci decided to invade Tamriel in the year 2703 of the First Era. The beginning steps of their invasion proved to be very successful, managing to steamroll through the northern part of Tamriel and its defending forces, eventually reaching the Gerald Mountains near Bruma. This success was short-lived as Remond I, the new general and emperor of the Cyrodiilic Empire, rose to take on the threat that the Akaviri invaders posed. He managed to rally the Colovian and Nibene armies in order to properly face the invaders, and this all culminated in the Battle of Pale Pass, where he managed to corner the invading Saci forces, cutting off their supply lines. This led some of them to flee back to Akavir, with the remaining forces pledging their loyalty to Remond I upon witnessing the power of his Thu'um. These remaining Saci forces were granted amnesty by Remond I, and they slowly bred into Imperial families and society. And even to this day, Saci heritage and surnames are a form of pride amongst Imperial nobility. After the Battle of Pale Pass, Remond's empire expanded at a rapid rate, growing into an economic and militaristic superpower, and most of this rapid expansion and success is attributed to the military prowess of the Saci forces that pledged their loyalty to the Second Empire. Their influence was imprinted in nearly every aspect of Imperial culture and their institutions, with the most important reforms being the creation of the Akavir Dragon Guard as the Emperor's personal guard, and the appropriation of the dragon symbol as the image of the Empire. Another interesting development Imperial society made under the Saci was the founding of the Fighters Guild. A Saci warrior named Daenerys Ves was responsible for bringing up the idea to the Saci potentate in charge of the Imperial throne after Remond's lineage failed in the year 320 of the Second Era, and this idea was proposed in response to the financial bankruptcy and rapid economic decline the Second Empire had suffered after the death of Remond's last successor. The Saci potentate in question was Versidiu Shea, and before his time as a potentate, he served as Remond III's advisor. It is believed that Versidiu secretly plotted to assassinate Remond's lineage, and all of Remond III's successors either died through battle or by hired assassins, leaving him without an heir and eventually dead. This is where Versidiu stepped in as a potentate, ruling for over 300 years until the year 324 of the Second Era. Versidiu was one of the few who was described as a serpent man, someone who had possessed physical attributes of both man and snake, but this can't be confirmed. Versidiu and his son were reported to have moved like eels, in a slithering motion, giving us a different potential outlook, but even then these reports might not be true. His son Savir and Chorek, who succeeded him, ruled for another 100 years before he was assassinated, and the Elder Council appointed someone of Imperial descent shortly after. When the line of Akavir potentates failed in the year 430 of the Second Era, most of the Saci fled from Cyrodiil, and they joined other Akavir settlements in Rim and elsewhere. These would be known as Rim Men. After this exodus, the Saci's presence in Cyrodiil started to quickly dwindle, and they generally disappeared from any prominent historical records. That is, until centuries later, when one of Tiber Septim's successors, Uriel V from the Septim Empire, managed to stabilize his empire and decided to look beyond Tamriel. He launched an invasion on Akavir, specifically on the isles between Tamriel and Akavir in the Padomaic Ocean, and then eventually on the southeastern part of mainland Akavir. The southeastern Akavir coast was home to the kingdom of the Saci, and this is where they landed. They initially found success during the first quarter of this invasion, capturing settlements they would name Septimia and Ionith, but this was mainly due to the poor resistance that the Saci showed in the beginning. Once Saci armies and mages actually armed themselves and communicated in response to this threat, the Imperial armies were quickly routed back to the coast in what would be called the Battle of Ionith in the year 290 of the Third Era. This led to the loss of at least one legion, with 4 others being captured, and it left Emperor Uriel V dead or enslaved. Only one Imperial naval fleet successfully managed to extract the others and sail to the Padomaic Ocean back to Tamriel, and we're not really sure what led to such a swift defeat. Some attribute it to the fact that they had far more advanced arts of combat, both magical and physical, and this might have been true due to the rumors that speak of how powerful Saci mages actually are. Now moving on, all of this brings me back to their origins and what race they truly are, and there are a couple of theories that are floating around the community about the true origins of the Saci. Now they are as follows: that the Saci are entirely human and are just advanced in terms of engineering and power. This is somewhat supported by the creation of the Skyhaven Temple during the Saci's invasion of Tamriel, and how Alduin's wall within the temple depicts them as men kneeling before a dragonborn. A report of Uriel V's invasion also describes the defending Saci forces as mounted men, with no mention of any snake-like attributes. Theory 2 states that the actual Saci are entirely snakes, and that they've used the enslaved men on Akavir as the main forces of their armies, with only the high-ranking officers being Saci snakes who control the bulk of their humanoid armies. Keep in mind that the Saci are notorious for keeping slaves such as goblins and lesser creatures. Regardless, this would have allowed for both the snake overlords and human forces to be categorized as Saci, leaving room for the human forces to easily assimilate into Imperial society. It would also give more reason for Reccomended's amnesty toward the invading Saci army by the end of the first invasion. Beside their approval of his doom, maybe he wanted to rid the human Akavir forces of their Saci snake masters. We'll never truly know. One thing to note, however, is that some Saci officers captured at Pale Pass were still reported as human, so take it as you will. Theory 3 states that there are 2 separate races on the territories of Akavir, human and the vampiric serpent-like beast folk, and that these two coexisted amongst each other. This theory believes that the Saci men are the ones that undertook the conquest to invade Tamriel in the First Era, and that they were predominantly the ones that centered their culture around dragon slaying and prophecies. There's a reason why they knew that Reccomended was a dragonborn, even if they've been isolated on their own continent for centuries, and I bet it's an indicator that they knew far more than Tamriel's society did. I also won't rule out the possibility that they could have bred with the snake folk, and that's why we see figures like the Saci potentate Versidouche, who's believed to have been someone with the upper extremities of a human and lower extremities of a serpent. Now the last theory I've heard delves into the shapeshifter topic I mentioned earlier in the video, and basically there are claims that the Saci are in fact only one race of vampiric serpent creatures who have the ability to shapeshift into humans or other forms. Now this might be a bit far-fetched, but it does explain why they could have masqueraded as men for such a while in hopes to successfully assimilate into the Empire and take it over via a Saci potentate. As we know, a Saci potentate did take over the reins of the Second Empire for a while, but the rumors about his anatomy are incredible, so we can't know for sure if the potentate was a serpent through and through. One thing I'm sure we can all agree on is that they seem to have originated from the wandering Elnofey, which might explain why every encounter that the people of Tamriel had with the Saci has shown that they're humanoid in nature, and that they even possess the ability to wield weapons and wear armor. Another interesting thing to note before we move on to the next race in line is that during the Elder Scrolls Online in the region of Stonefalls, there's a certain quest which has you bless the bones of the people who died because of a second Akavir invasion, and the quest reward is an item which reads, "These gauntlets were designed to choke the scaled throats of the Akaviri invaders." One specific veteran called Fedrasa Andrethi of the aforementioned invasion is also absolutely terrified of anything reptilian since the war. Other NPCs related to the invasion often also refer to the invaders as the Snakes and Snake Men, even though the invaders of the second Akavir invasion were predominantly from the Kamal race. The remaining Saci from the Rimmon settlement and elsewhere only joined the surviving Kamahl forces later after the defeat in Morrowind, so it seems that they were either Saci forces with the Kamahl at the beginning of the second invasion, or I've just found an oversight on Bethesda's part. Now, after hearing all of these theories, tell me which one you think is most likely true.
Thank you, Mr. Sith, and as you all heard, there's quite a bit of information on the Saci that we can say and that we can speculate about. But the other races of Akavir are far less in terms of the information that we know about them, so the next parts are going to be a bit shorter. So next in line is Kamahl, and Kamahl is not just the name of a country or a race, no, it's the name of both. Both the nation and the race inhabiting said nation is called Kamahl. The creatures that make up this race are described as primal snow demons who live in the region of Kamahl, which translates to snow hell. Once per year it's said that this race gets out of their own region and then proceeds to terrorize all the other inhabitants and regions of Akavir, but their target of choice is usually the Tang Mo, which is a race of monkeys, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now this of course makes them all sound pretty dumb like wild animals, but they're not. They're an intelligent race, because a notable event that the Kamahl instigated was the second Akaviri invasion of Tamriel, and it was a pretty bold attempt at terrorizing Tamriel. Their demonic warlord and king at the time, called Adasum Dir Kamahl, attempted to spearhead an invasion and landed his ships on the mount of the White River north of Windhelm in the year 572 of the Second Era. King Dir Kamahl led his armies through the Sea of Ghosts, past Morrowind and other islands surrounding it, making this a pretty unexpected visit for the Nords of Skyrim. And the Nordic population and their royalty were obviously caught off guard as the fleet of Kamahl warships arrived to completely obliterate them. Dir Kamahl's offensive resulted in the sacking of Windhelm, with the Palace of Kings being left intact yet still heavily damaged. As the city of Windhelm was sacked, the royal family that ruled over it suffered a gruesome fate, leaving the queen and her daughter dead. It seemed grim, but hope was not lost, for a certain Nord hero called Yoren the Skald King, who was related to the deceased queen, was still alive and ready for a fight. While the Kamahl forces moved southward towards Riften, Yoren managed to rally the armies of Eastmarch and the Rift in order to defend the city of Riften from further sacking. And this is where the tide started turning in the war. Not only did Yoren amass an army to defend Riften, but he also had the Greybeard summon Wulfheart the Ash King from Sovngarde, who would become the deciding factor in the defense of Riften and subsequently Skyrim. Yoren and his armies managed to fend off the attacking Kamahl troops, leading to Dir Kamahl to reroute his troops to Morrowind. But Yoren didn't stop at the borders of Skyrim and simply followed the Kamahl into Morrowind, hoping to finish them off completely. King Dir Kamahl attempted to invade the northern region of Stonefalls in Morrowind, and this is where he first came into contact with the Tribunal. Meanwhile, not far behind his armies were the Nordic armies with Wulfheart and Yoren, and coming to the aid of both the Nords and the Dunmer were Argonian Shellbacks. This really unusual alliance of the Nords, the Dunmer and the Argonians, three races who were usually just at each other's throat against a common enemy, resulted in the defeat of the Kamahl and their king, who was killed at the Red Mountain by Almalexia and Wulfheart. Although this invasion was somewhat of a failure, Dir Kamahl is still remembered as the most famous member of the Kamahl race, and many of the surviving Kamahl soldiers eventually joined the surviving Saci in the settlement of Rimmon and elsewhere after his death. Unfortunately, they and most of the remaining Saci in Rimmon would eventually all be killed as they tried to start a war in Cyrodiil to get rid of the Emperor at the time, a pretender emperor named Atrebus, who had branded all the Akaviri races outlaws since he opposed foreigners in Cyrodiil. The remaining Kamahl and Saci attempted to get rid of him in an invasion, but unsuccessfully, leading to almost all of them being killed in their attempts by the Empire at the time. Now, moving on, let's talk about the Capotun. The nation of Capotun, which translates to Tiger Dragon Empire, was formerly known as Potun, and the race of this nation also goes by the same name. They are a race of tiger-like catfolk who are rumored to be in similar anatomy to the Khajiit. This race has never attempted to invade Tamriel, but they're at constant odds with the Saci and consider them their greatest enemy. The dragons of Nirn also have a history with this tiger-like race, because even though a lot of the dragons in Akavir either fled the continent or were enslaved or killed by the Saci, some dragons managed to flee to the province of Potun, and the dragons that fled to Potun somehow got caught in the war between the Potun and the Saci, and they were all eventually killed apparently. This war left both the Saci and the Potun in an immensely weakened state, and ever since then the Potun have adamantly attempted to turn themselves into dragons. The reason for this desire to turn themselves into dragons might be linked to their possible admiration of the dragons, or they may be just in pursuit of their great power, as they probably witnessed the great power of dragons during the war. Regardless of their intentions, rumor has it that a divine being and their leader, called Toshraka, eventually succeeded at actually transforming himself into a large orange and black dragon. Some parties believe that this is purely metaphorical, but the book Mysterious Akavir claims that the changes were actually physical and that he has all the traits of a dragon. Apparently he got crowned king of the race, and following his coronation he renamed the race and the nation from the Potun to the Kapotun in an effort to rise above the Saci Empire and ushered in a new era for his people. It's said that Toshraka's rise to power made the nation of Kapotun the most powerful empire on Akavir, even more so than the Saci Empire. Some sources even state that they've allied themselves with the Tengmo race, one of the other races of Akavir, in order to further strengthen their power. Toshraka's goals are, as of now, to obliterate the Saci and eventually launch a full-scale invasion on Tamriel, but we'll see if that ever comes to fruition. Would be fun if we see that in Elder Scrolls 6, wouldn't it? Lastly, we have the Tengmo race of Akavir. They are viewed as a race of generous and kind monkey people who inhabit the 1,000 Monkey Isles on Akavir. There are various breeds of Tengmo, and every breed is known for their multiple behavioral traits such as bravery, simplicity, and some are believed to be completely nuts, completely insane. They tend to largely keep to themselves and their own islands, not really instigating or invading any surrounding territories. Although somewhat peaceful, the Tengmo are capable of gathering their armies in times of need and have always defended their islands successfully, even if they're at the constant threat of being captured for slavery by the other nations of Akavir. The Kamal in particular have had many altercations with the Tengmo, but it never really goes in favor for the Kamal, as the Tengmo manage to repel them each year. However, the Tengmo have been making strides in terms of allies recently. As I've said before, there's a rumor that they've allied themselves with their former enemies in the Kapotun. In conclusion, I think we can agree that the continent of Akavir is home to several weird and interesting races, basically just as Tamriel. But even then, we know little to nothing about the true power that each of these races possesses as collective nations, or what their nation structures are, or, what their intentions towards Tamriel are. We know a little bit, but not much. We don't even know if there's maybe even more intelligent races, but hey, it's another continent we've never been to, so it's unlikely that we'll ever find out. And that was my list of some of the more obscure races of the Elder Scrolls universe. It wasn't all of them definitely, but definitely some of the interesting ones. And I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. Now, if you made it all the way through this video, all the way to this end, why not leave a comment with your hair color in the comments? I promise, I'm not trying to stalk you, but if you do, I will know that you watched this video all the way to the end, and it was so random that it will confuse the hell out of people in the comments, which is fun. At least I thought it was very funny, and I am my own target audience anyway, so give me a laugh. Anyway, it's been a very long video, so thank you to the Patreon subscribers on screen for making this possible, and I will see all of you again in my regular lore videos almost every weekend. See ya!